The Black community or Black culture, it's a concoction that was made in a Hollywood basement. Black isn't just an ethnicity. Black is a political statement. King is somebody who is celebrated around the world. And I say this not to be provocative, but he was a degenerate. He moved us from a trying race to a crying race.
In essence, the civil rights movement is what led to the Black community.
Feeling sorry for ourselves. I know what I'm saying sounds very provocative, but this is the reality of what unfolded. When Klan membership was at its highest, lynchings were actually at their lowest. What the press would do is they would take this violence and they would basically recontextualize it to make it look like the Klan was just going out trying to find a Negro to string up. The Klan was actually a kind of pyramid scheme.
Dad, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
I have been looking forward to this a lot. Sincerely. You know,
I think I ran into you I came at the tail end of one of the Confluence events. I think this was like either last year or the year before that. And I spoke with you briefly.
But, for like 2 seconds.
For 2 seconds.
Yeah.
You're on your way
hey,
out.
What's up?
I was on my way in. So
I was running around doing stuff.
There you go.
That's how it goes, producing an event. You know, it's funny. I'm usually like really good with remembering meeting people. And I do remember meeting you for a second. But the amount of people that come up to me and said, I met you at Confluence. I'm like, that's a different context.
Yeah.
My mind's like 20 different places at once.
Right.
Laura Day sitting off camera here, and she knows she was at the last one. I was like a chicken with my head cut off. Yeah, accurate, she says.
Nice.
So I guess I'll just start by asking you, how did your recent debate go? By the time this comes out, that'll probably have aired too. But I just want to know how that went. Debating, I presume MLK, right?
Yeah, so we were debating the MLK, the topic of MLK's legacy. And the gentleman I was debating, his name is Austin Julio Broughton. He's kind of a newcomer in the social media space. He kind of came to online notoriety by participating in a couple of Jubilee debates, the surrounded debates that they have. And
is that the debate where they have one guy sitting there and then like a bunch of people and then they like hit a timer and run up?
Right.
Okay.
It's a very odd debate style.
Yeah.
Something I would never participate in. But he was on the one with a young woman by the name of Amanda Seales. Okay. And then another one with Shank Geiger from the Young Turks. And from there, he went on and did other podcasts and stuff. And so he's a Black conservative who have aspirations for running for president. And he's a huge admirer of Martin Luther King. He said he's been studying King since he was 8 years old. And he's been, he's dedicated his life to learning all of his sermons and his speeches. And he can quote them and he can even sound like King. So he's a fanatic, to say the least. So he wanted to debate me on the topic because he's seen some of the things that I've been saying, and I think he maybe even watched some of my recent docuseries. So there's a podcaster by the name of Sean Kelly who has a podcast out in Las Vegas, and so they invited me on. Initially, I was kind of reluctant to do it because this subject matter is something that I don't typically debate, and it's not that I'm afraid of debating. It's just that for me as a researcher and an independent historian who spends a lot of time in archives and looking at period publications and newspaper articles to try to recontextualize history, I'm only interested in the facts. Right. And the question I had is, well, what is there really to debate? Are we debating what the facts are? Because anybody can go and fact check me and look at the information for themselves. But what I realized is that, well, what you can debate is the interpretation of the facts. And King is somebody who is celebrated around the world on both sides of the political spectrum because we're all taught to celebrate him from a very early age. I mean, it's in our public schools. We get it every January and during so-called Black History Month. We get it in entertainment. Every celebrity, not every celebrity, but a lot of celebrities, I mean, they've included, homage to King in music and television. There's so many films that celebrate him. There's a movie Selma, there's Eyes on the Prize. There's so many books written about him in a very admirable way. He's celebrated in politics. There's a 40-foot statue of him in Washington, D.C. Anytime a politician, be he on the right or the left, is trying to push some new social justice policy, they would, of course, invoke the name of Martin Luther King and how he would want this. And so every aspect of society, every institution, it's very pervasive, it's very inundative, that it's just established thought that King is somebody who needs to be celebrated. and the civil rights movement is basically good. So that's what I'm having to contend with. And a lot of people have heard my perspective. They've heard my presentations and the things that I'm saying, which basically looks at it from a different perspective. And I've had the benefit of being able to go and to give talks and to give lectures and through documentary filmmaking, present the facts, present the information. But I haven't had the chance to actually present the information up against somebody who actually admires King and admires the movement. So I saw it at the very least a good opportunity to actually bring those two together and really duke it out. So I agreed to do it. And the debate went for like 2.5 hours. Wow. And what was interesting about that is when you're dealing with or contending with the pervasivity of such a looming narrative like that, you can't do it with sound bites. You can't do it with talking points.
Well, the problem is in like modern social media culture is that so much context is inherently missing. You need all of the context.
Precisely.
For as much as possible.
Exactly.
Which is why I prefer long form, which is why my average episode length is 2 hours and 45 minutes.
There you go. There you go.
Context is very important.
Context is key. Yeah. And so that's what I attempted to do, is to try to give it context, try to let it breathe, and really chronological context of the way that the events transpired. Because you can't just start with King. You actually have to start with the backstory of the infiltration of communism into America, specifically into the South, Montgomery, Atlanta, Birmingham, which precedes King. I mean, these things existed in the South years before King was even born. You saw communist activity that was going on under the Southern Negro Youth Congress, who would put on events in the South that Daddy King, who's Martin Luther King's father, would participate in. And so he was kind of born into this milieu. And he would basically take the baton and keep it moving, as it were. So you have to really give that backstory. And what's interesting is that with someone like an Austin, who I debated, who is used to debating on social media, it's interesting because, they try to box you into a corner and force you to choose this dichotomy. That's a false dichotomy. And you have to know what's going on, and you have to be able to call out those fallacies.
That's what I was just about to say.
Yeah, you have to call out those fallacies and then bring it back. So I would be basically unfolding something, and people will see this when they watch it. I'll be unfolding something, and then he would try to cut me off and switch the subject real quick. And I will let him go, but then it was my turn to speak again. I'll just pick right back up where I left off, because you really have to give people the backstory. You owe that to the audience if you're challenging an approved narrative like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because irrespective of what people believe, the burden of proof lies on the individual making the positive claim. So if the claim is that like MLK was a hero because X, Y, and Z, the burden of proof is on them. And a lot of people will try to flip that, whether it's with medicine. I get that a lot with challenging virology. They'll say, well, no, the burden of proof is on you to dismantle the prevailing narrative. I'm like, it doesn't matter how many people believe the prevailing narrative. The burden of proof is on them to provide sufficient evidence for their positive claim. And if that evidence has not been met, then there's no proof for their claim. So we need to look at this from other angles. So it's really interesting, like the cultural phenomenon. I guess you could attribute that to lack of true education. Definitely a lack of education on logical fallacies and like what constitutes a good argument. But it's something that's like rampant among society, especially in social media culture. But what led to you questioning all of this in the first place?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I grew up just like your average American student, learning about the virtues and the glory of King and the civil rights movement. And I believed it. I genuinely believed it. I believed that as a youngster growing up in Mansfield, Texas, which is a predominantly white town, where I was treated the same as my white classmates, and in fact was celebrated for many things, including the fact that I was a football player and I was artistic and all the things. And even without those things, I felt welcome, and I didn't feel ostracized or anything like that. And I thought that was thanks to the work of King, naturally. And so when I was in high school, I used to listen to this pastor by the name of Malcom. He's now passed as of earlier this year. And he said something that really kind of rocked my world, which is that Martin Luther King was a socialist. And at first I rejected that. I was like, okay, he's right about everything else, but on this subject, he's just completely wrong about. And so I began to look into it more and more, and it turns out he was actually right. And it actually was far worse than he said in whatever context it was that he spoke. So anyway, I began to look more into not only Black history, but American history. I began to look into the founding documents and the debates that the founding fathers were having when it came to nation building. What kind of nation will we be? And that's a very interesting debate. I mean, I think we accept wholesale that the Federalists were right, the Anti-Federalists were wrong. Alexander Hamilton, someone worth celebrating. I mean, they just did a play a few years ago on Broadway called Hamilton. So this kind of perspective is the one that we're conditioned to believe is the right way. But when you look into that perspective, ultimately what it seeks is the ever expanding authority of the federal government. That's what that perspective seeks to do. Whereas with the Anti-Federalists, they really took seriously the sovereignty of the states, sovereignties of the township, sovereignty of the family, and of the individual. When you look at the writings of people like Luther Martin, Patrick Henry, and
Andrew Jackson,
even, yeah, Robert Yates, when you look at their writings, what you get a sense of is they didn't believe that a large nation made up of so many people who all have different perspectives, different backgrounds, different walks of life,
different geographical
contexts, right? To hand them a constitutional republic or a democracy and say, look, this is your nation. You have a say in which direction it goes. That sounds good from the surface, but the hostility and the turmoil that comes off the back of that is par for the course. This is why we have to take seriously, again, the local community, the township, the state. You have to take that seriously, but to cede all authority to the federal government, that's a problem. And again, all of the division, all of the turmoil, all of the conflict is par for the course. That's going to inevitably happen when you're when you're on the one hand trying to get rid of the electoral college and have an absolute democracy and then on top of that, you're trying to enfranchise literally everybody. I mean, you have moves right now to lower the voting age, I think to 16. And some people want to lower it to 12 even. They want to include people who are currently incarcerated, as well as people who are here illegally, just expand it all the more. And then on top of that, turn it into an absolute democracy. That sounds attractive to a lot of people, unfortunately. But the turmoil that ensues as a result of having something like that, I don't think people care to think too much about. So I say all that to say that when you look at somebody like a king, he's part of that tradition of wanting to expand federal authority, which is one and the same with what the communists want. Because communists, they envision a society where there's no such thing as property rights or individual liberty. They want to centralize all power and authority into one place. And so in many ways, the communist goal is one and the same with the federal expansion goal. And King was basically kind of the chosen galvanizer to bring that into fruition in the 1960s. Again, it precedes him, but it would come to a kind of climactic point in the 1960s, especially with the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which expanded the federal authority into businesses and small businesses in particular, because it gave the government control into how your local businesses ran, in a sense. And again, that's in keeping with the Marxist agenda, the Marxist goal, which is a kind of a controlling of goods and services, centralization of goods and services. And it starts off in an incremental way, and it keeps growing. The federal authority keeps growing gradually, era after era, generation after generation. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a huge leap in that direction, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. If you frequently tune into the Way Forward podcast, don't skip this one. This is personal. If you've ever felt a shift from something that you've heard on this podcast, if it's helped you to see things more clearly, if it's helped you to break down a limiting belief system, if it's helped you just to generally question, or if it's helped you to feel less alone, then I'm asking you from my heart to help us keep going. We're not backed by corporate sponsors, venture capital money, or big donors, and that has been a deliberate choice. And we've said no to a lot of ad deals that weren't aligned because we don't want our mission to be shaped by products, brands, and agendas that we don't actually believe in. There are a few trusted brands and products that do support us, and we're incredibly grateful for that. But the reality is, this is primarily sustained by our listeners and viewers. Right now, this podcast has roughly 140,000 video and audio downloads a month, and it's continuing to grow. And only a small fraction of that actually help contribute financially. That's not a guilt trip, it's just the reality. We haven't said this directly enough, so here it is. If you'd like this podcast to continue, please help support us by becoming a member of thewayforward.com. If even a small fraction of listeners and viewers chose to support, we'd be able to easily sustain this. A membership at thewayforward.com is $99 annually, which amounts to about $8 a month. Think of it like a couple organic kombuchas at your local health food store, or maybe a fancy latte every month. And also think of it like this. In addition to ensuring that we can continue, you're actively supporting yourself in the process. Thewayforward.com is a private membership platform that allows you to instantly connect with aligned people, practitioners, farms, schools, restaurants, and more in your local area. And if the platform isn't for you, we've added a donation option as well. You'll find both of those in the show notes. If you've received something from the show, please consider giving back by becoming a member so we can continue to reach people, not just as a podcast, but as a movement for something good, true, and beautiful. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for walking this path with us. You know, what comes up for me in discussing this and discussing like whether King was a positively influential figure during the civil rights movement and whether he left a positive or negative lasting impact upon the culture of really America, but especially like Black culture and the Black community. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'll get to this later, on like what overwhelmingly, and this is going to be a very general statement or a general question, like what the Black community looked like prior to the civil rights movement, and then the results after the civil rights movement in terms of, like socioeconomic status, like nuclear family, all those things, like comparing and contrasting the two, and like asking the question, like, is the Black community better off after the civil rights movement? I'd love to hear your perspective on that. Before we get there though, I want to go back to the discussion of slavery, if we could, because from my current understanding, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Obviously, the South was problematic in that it had, like, slavery was a pervasive amongst the South at the time, right? And Black people were being enslaved. And I've heard, and this is my current understanding, that under the guise of abolishing slavery, the 13th and 14th Amendment were put forth in order to create a federalized citizenship that in some way made all of us commercial slaves in a certain way. I don't know if you've looked into that at all, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on slavery. And the larger point that I'm getting at was that an act of centralizing power in and of itself by removing some of the states' rights? Because like at the time, each state was effectively its own nation that has over time, both with the civil rights movement, but also with like the Civil War, has slowly decreased over time, if you get what I'm getting at.
So you used the word obviously earlier, and I don't know that it is obvious that the South was problematic, to be frank with you. The fact of the matter is slavery existed all over the world up until that point, and still after, and still exists to this very day. And it's interesting because, I mean, we tend to judge what was going on in those days from a kind of 21st century liberal, and I say liberal not in the exclusive political sense of the word, but from a culturally liberal 21st century perspective. It's easy to vilify that portion of history, when in reality, if you look at the secession of the South, the reasons that they wanted to secede were actually warranted in terms of the tariffs and the taxes that were being imposed on the South by the North. And if you look at the writings of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States, he wasn't a fanatic for slavery. In fact, he believed that slavery should be ended. He just didn't believe that it should be ended in one fell swoop. He believed that these things take time. He didn't believe that slavery should exist in perpetuity. He just believed that the South should have the right to end slavery in the same fashion that the North was able to end slavery. And this was actually happening.
Not an externally imposed. Got it.
Not an externally imposed situation. And if you look at the slave narratives which was a project conducted in the 1930s, and you listen to the slaves themselves about what life was like on the plantation. Sure, there were some whose experiences were abysmal and inhumane, but that wasn't the norm. That was a rare situation. If you look at our perspective of slavery, and I'm not condoning slavery, nor am I advocating for it, but
you're just speaking to what is objectively true.
What is objectively true.
Yeah.
If you look at our perspective of slavery, most of it is Northern propaganda. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by a white woman from Connecticut named Harriet Beecher Stowe. When you look at the blistering writings about the South by H.L. Mencken was from North Maryland. When you look at the movie Roots or the show Roots, that was written by Alex Haley, who I think was up in New York or something like that. And that's just a fraction of what we have available in terms of what slavery was like. A lot of slaves were being paid money, and they were able to, with that money, buy their freedom. And in buying their freedom, they went and bought slaves themselves, many of them.
It's more indentured servitude than it is slavery.
Right. Some of it was for indentured servitude. Other situations were literally, you work the land. So that is to say that prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to mechanism and all the things that we enjoy today, that was how the economy was ran. Again, I'm not advocating for it, nor am I condoning it. I'm just saying that was kind of the way things were. And so there's a lot of studies on this. There's a lot of information on this. In fact, what the consensus was for a lot of freed Blacks was that conditions for them were actually better under slavery than under Reconstruction. The Reconstruction period is when we get our 13th and 14th Amendment, which did exactly what you said.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to get at. Like, it made all of us commercial slaves.
It made all of us commercial slaves.
Yep.
And this is what was desired by many of the radical Republicans in Congress, many of whom were in cahoots with Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in particular, they were pen pals with certain Union war generals and politicians. There's a book, I think it's out of print now, but you can still find it. I have a copy. It's called Letters to Americans. And in Letters to Americans, this is basically a book of correspondence letters between Marx, Engels, and American Unionists. And they're talking about the issue of slavery and how this can give way to the proletariat revolution. When you look at Thaddeus Stevens, who was a radical Republican, and it's interesting because, I'm nonpartisan. I tend to vote conservative. However, I don't really think my vote does much of anything. But I don't believe—
Is that a new realization? Just as offhand?
I probably felt this way for the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay, got you.
But the reality of it is there was no party switch. However, it's not a question of whether the party switched. It's rather a question of what was the beliefs and the motives of a given party in a given era. If we're talking about the 1800s, the Republicans were in alignment with this proletarian revolution. This is what they wanted. Whereas if you are going into the early part of the 20th century, you still had that. But as you get into the middle part of the 20th century, you see more communist infiltration going on with the Democrat Party. So for me, I don't ask the question of whether the party switched. Rather, I ask the question of at what point were the communists more involved in this party versus that party? And as you get into the middle part of the 20th century, it just so happened to be the Democrats. I mean, if you look at Robert La Follette in the early 20th century, he was a Republican, but he was his era's version of Bernie Sanders today. He was using the same talking points that Bernie Sanders is using, and he's a Democrat. Or he's an independent, but he lobbies with the Democrats in Congress. So anyway, all that to say that slavery is a complex issue. I don't take this kind of black and white, no pun intended, view of it. Again, you have to look at everything in its proper context. And after slavery, you did have freed Blacks who migrated north, and many, I think most actually, who stayed put in the South. And it's interesting because I delved into the archives of Blacks who stayed put in the South and then wouldn't migrate to California or to New York or Baltimore until the middle part of the 20th century. And the consensus among them was that we should have stayed. We should have stayed in the South. We should have stayed in Georgia or Louisiana. One woman said that because she was in Compton at this point in California, and she was from Louisiana, and she said, I should have stayed in Louisiana. She said, there I have to say yes, sir, and no, sir. And here I could say yes and no, but I'd rather be in a place where I could say yes, sir, and no, sir, and live well off than be living in the slums and I can say yes and no. So anyway, that you know, I don't believe that I answered fully your question.
No, that was great. That was sufficient for me.
But the 13th and 14th Amendment, yes, it goes hand in hand with exactly what I was talking about earlier, which is this quest to expand federal authority through mass enfranchisement.
Through creating a straw man, really, because like in effect, because it's not that slavery wasn't in question, but what I mean by a straw man is they're propping up slavery as like the thing. That's a historical narrative we're taught to believe. In fact, my alma mater, which I'm not very proud of, I am in some respects, but United States Military Academy at West Point put out a massive video series just after I graduated that was quote unquote debunking the idea that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. And one of our chief professors at West Point got on camera and said, of course the Civil War was about slavery, and then went on into this like long diatribe. But that's what we're taught to believe, is that it was almost exclusively about slavery. And that was just a fraction of what it was actually about. So they prop that up to create this big boogeyman. Like, look what we're doing. Look at this very noble thing that we are now ending, when in reality, it was about expanding the power of a centralized authority.
That's absolutely what it's about. I mean, again, people can look at Letters to Americans. There's another one called The Civil War. It is additional materials on Marx and Engels and their influence or their desires to basically use because that's the thing about communists, and this is why I bring this up, is part of what they do tactically is try to find something to exploit and exacerbate for a desired outcome. They've done this with race. They've done this with slavery. They've done this with sex. They've done this, with the gay liberation movement in the 1960s and 70s. They try to find something to exploit. And then you see this, of course, with cultural Marxism, especially. Of course, Marxism initially was a issue of economics and class struggle. Dialectical materialism. But what the cultural Marxists discovered is that this tactic can be used on more than just the economic front. It can be used on the cultural front as well. And King was very much a part of that. So to get back to your first question about life for Black Americans prior to the Civil Rights Movement. So out of slavery, going into Reconstruction, and then coming out of Reconstruction, there was a lot that was in disrepair. And the South in particular were trying to figure out how to get their feet underneath them. And in the aftermath of the war between the states, you have to understand there were the loss of brothers and fathers and sons. And you had a lot of infliction that was happening as a result of what Northern Union soldiers were doing to the South. The carpetbaggers, the scallywags, so on and so forth. And this created a lot of tension and friction. And there was what a lot of these soldiers were doing, where they were pitting Southern Negroes against Southern whites. And you had a lot of segregation that came out of that. And then, of course, you have Plessy versus Ferguson, which enacted separate but equal. And in response to this, responsible Negro and white leaders came together, and they tried to figure out, how to go about living alongside each other with the ultimate goal of breaking down those racial barriers, so on and so forth. Chief among them was Booker T. Washington, who delivered a speech in Atlanta, Georgia, called the Atlanta Exposition Speech. This is 1898, I believe. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it's 1898. So he delivers a speech, and he famously says, "Cast down your bucket where you are." And what he meant by that is, don't worry about what's going on around you. Don't worry about a lot of the things that you're being told by demagogues to worry about. Worry about what you have control over. Family formation, honing a skill, becoming your own man of honor, becoming a woman of virtue. focus on what you have, cast down your bucket where you are. He delivered this speech before an integrated audience of both blacks and whites. And after having delivered this speech, he got a standing ovation. And he started something called the Negro Business League, which was meant to try to encourage entrepreneurship among blacks. There was a man by the name of Philip Payton Jr., who was a realtor, took Booker T. Washington's message. He went to New York, specifically Harlem, which was predominantly white at the time. He bought an apartment building there, filled it with black renters. He began to buy more and more buildings. And as a result of his work, Harlem became black. And you saw the popping up of business districts across the South. We call them now Black Wall Streets. This was happening in North Carolina, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana, all these Black Wall Streets that were popping up. And initially, there was a man by the name of George Schuyler who was hostile to what Booker T. Washington was talking about, what he was trying to do.
Was this a white guy?
He was a black guy.
He's a black guy, okay.
A black northerner who wrote for a paper called the Pittsburgh Courier.
What were his qualms with Booker T. Washington?
He thought that Booker T. Washington was subjecting black folks to a life of servitude. And
what was his argument?
Inferiority. It went hand in hand with the kinds of critiques that people like W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP were lobbying against Booker T. Washington and the Negro Business League. So he believed this until he himself traveled the South. And when he traveled the South and he saw the success, he would actually write glowingly about the South. And he saw early on in the early 1920s that the communists were deliberately trying to sabotage black businesses because they had a vested interest in trying to galvanize blacks and get them to kind of join their ranks. There was a convention, a communist convention that took place in, I think, 1920 or 1921, the Second Congress of the Communist International, the Comintern. And there was an American muckraker journalist by the name of John Reed. He was white, and he was a delegate at this convention. And they were trying to figure out how to infiltrate America. They wanted to infiltrate the West, but they were trying to infiltrate America. And John Reed said, well, the way to do it is through the Negro. He said that the Negro is newly freed from slavery, and they're beginning to make their way through the capitalist system. And the more that they become capitalists, which is a word I reject, by the way, but we can probably get into that later on. The more they become capitalists, the less of a chance we have of actually expanding our ideology in the States. And he said, what we need to do is we need to raise the political consciousness of the American Negro. So as a result of this, Vladimir Lenin himself greenlit using any means necessary to raise the political consciousness of the American Negro. So over the course of the 1920s, we saw all these race riots springing up seemingly out of nowhere. This was going on all across the South. And the science behind that is, if I'm Joe the shoe store owner, I own a shoe store in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm able to make a living for myself. I sell shoes to my Negro neighbors, the miners, the teachers, everybody buys shoes at my shoe store. But then there's a race riot that pops up, springs up seemingly out of nowhere. And then tomorrow I don't have a business to go to. And I'm not able to pay my bills. I'm not able to provide a service to my community. But then I open up my newspaper and I see an article, are you tired of racial discrimination? Join the IWW, which was a communist front. Join the NAACP, join this movement, join that movement. That becomes very attractive to me. So I want to now join something that is meant to fight for me politically, to protect my business, to protect my way of life. The whole purpose of it was to chase you into the bosom of this radical movement. And so this was going on, all across the South. You saw the deliberate infiltration of communists into groups like the Klan and other white supremacist groups with the objective of inciting violence. Roland G. Fryer, who is a Harvard professor, he's a black man. He did a study in 2011, which investigated the history of the Ku Klux Klan. And he found that in the 1920s, and he's not a conservative, I think he's pretty apolitical, in fact, but he found that in the 1920s, when Klan membership was at its highest, lynchings were actually at their lowest. He basically made the point that the Klan was actually a kind of pyramid scheme. It was a means by which, like, politicians and elitists, they had their little Klan chapters, and you had to basically be a dues paying member. And the promise was that by becoming a Klan member, you get camaraderie, you get a network where you can get access to jobs and things of this nature. And that was why a lot of people joined the Klan, because they thought that they would get something out of it in terms of social status or a job or what have you.
It's like a messed up social club.
Precisely. So you did have violence between the Klan and the communists. You had the Klan who were attacking the communists. You had the communists who were attacking the Klan. And it was basically like a gang. It was basically gang violence. It's like the Bloods and the Crips going at it. But what the press would do is they would take this violence and they would basically recontextualize it to make it look like the Klan was just going out trying to find a Negro to string up, when in reality it was more complex than that. Again, I'm not making any kind of, I'm not trying to romanticize the Klan by any stretch of the imagination. It's just to say this is what was actually happening and what was actually going on.
On that note, real quick, maintain your train of thought. Don't lose it. But there were objective, like racist, violent people who may have also participated in the KKK at that time and in other white supremacist organizations.
Right. Yeah, there were. But the pervasiveness of it is what I'm challenging. Because even though you had such people who existed, you saw a lot of upward mobility that was happening among Blacks, which is what I was talking about earlier with the Negro Business League, the Black Wall Streets. 4 out of 5 Black children were growing up in 2-parent households. Marriage rates were doing better than white communities in many regions of the country. You saw an expansion in entrepreneurship and home ownership, even though you had redlining and all the things. The reality of it is, in a community in the Black South, you know, you had your miners, you had your doctors, you had your lawyers, you had your school teachers. They all lived in the same context. The children who were growing up in these contexts, they may have been the child of a miner or a sanitation worker, but they were in the same neighborhood as their as their doctor or dentist, and they had aspirations of you know, being like that guy or this guy. So you didn't have the high crime rates and everything else that we see today.
So really what we're talking about then is the Black community at that time almost paralleled, if you will, for lack of a better term, the white community in terms of success, however we want to measure those. But at the least, like nuclear family, like being raised with both parents there, high moral standards, not involved in crime, not involved in degeneracy. And then after the civil rights movement, and I want to talk like infiltration of hip hop culture and things like this too. And also CIA infiltration too. I'd love to get your thoughts on that, especially when it came to the war on drugs, but we can talk about that later. What we see now amongst the Black community, and again, this is a very general statement. This is not an exclusive statement, of course, but is the exact opposite of that. And that's just the reality. That is what is true.
Right, 100%. So, I mean, you saw that going on. Again, Thomas Sowell writes about the upward mobility that I'm talking about here. The late Walter E. Williams, Vodi Bakum have wrote about it. I've researched it. It was trending in the right direction. And these were people who were, again, following the program, the trajectory laid forth by people like Booker T. Washington and others. And they were yielding benefits that were tangible and that were recognizable and noticeable. And as a result of this, you saw the falling away, the repealing of Jim Crow laws at the private, local, and sometimes state level, all before 1954, which was the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And even in the context where some of these Jim Crow laws existed, they weren't being enforced. Like, for example, with the Montgomery bus boycott, by and large, a lot of these bus drivers in Montgomery, Alabama in the mid-50s weren't enforcing the rules where Blacks had to enter into the back door and all this. There were a few bus drivers who were enforcing it. And that was those were the bus drivers who were specifically targeted in order to pull off this whole bus boycott, because it was a whole demonstration of situation. And to take it back to the individuals that you speak of who were legitimately racist or white supremacist or what have you, what's interesting about that is they are responsible for what they did, and I'm not making any apologies for what they did. But the fascinating thing about agitation and propaganda is that it's meant to invoke or provoke, rather, reactionaryism. And how that reactionaryism unfolds is it could be a number of different things. It can be rational or it can be irrational. And we see this even today when it comes to the border issue and things like that. There's people, the public is constantly being gaslit. And how you respond to being gaslit, like that's your responsibility, There's people who take a very hostile and in some cases even prejudiced or racist view of people who live south of the border because we have the issue of immigration. That's irrational. That's irrational thinking. That can lead to irrational behavior. But the people who are doing the agitation and propaganda, that's precisely what they want. They want that irrational reactionaryism because they can then use that reactionaryism as a poster child to pass legislation, to get things done in Congress. And that was the purpose all along. And so the Southern guy who, I hate all niggers or whatever the case may be, who is saying that because of what he's seeing constantly in the press and the newspaper or whatever. Yes, it's wrong for him to have that view, and there's no excuse for it. But at the same time, that's precisely the reaction that is desired by people who are fanning the flames with agitation and propaganda. I know what I'm saying sounds very provocative, but again, this is a reality of what unfolded.
Well, I'm over here nodding my head because you're 100% correct, man. I mean, we see that amongst like so many avenues when it comes to like the whole COVID era. It was the same type of thing, like finding a very easy target of some, like, for example, some general contractor in Ottawa, Canada, who's making some claim about lack of evidence for virology in order to prop him up and be like, see, look at this nonsense, rather than someone like Dr. Tom Cowan, Dr. Sam and Mark Bailey, like some credentialed experts in their respective fields who are making those exact same claims. And this is commonplace. Like, this is a propaganda technique that has been used for I don't know how long at this point,
And the goal is, yes, to provoke reactionaryism. The more irrational, the better. But it's also to emotionalize the public. Because to the extent that I react irrationally or even violently to propaganda or agitation, and then I'm used as a poster child for, see, this is the bigotry that we don't want, the public will then kind of get the cue of like, okay, I don't want to be associated with that guy. Let me now move more and more to the political thinking and the ideology of the person who initiated the propaganda and the agitation, not really realizing that they're the hidden hand behind all of it, if that makes sense. So again, I'm not laying everything at the feet of communists and Marxists, but I think that there is well-documented history of their either creating hoaxes or taking advantage of and exploiting real grievances in order to reach their desired goals.
Most of you are already aware that our everyday devices are taking a real toll on human biology. Talking about our laptops, our tablets, our phones. Each one of these is hitting you with non-native EMFs, artificial light, excessive blue light, and constant screen flicker. And most of us are feeling the harmful effects whether we realize it or not. But there is a better option. Daylight Computer is actually solving all these problems at the root. And I had an awesome conversation with Tristan Scott from Daylight on episode 202, breaking all this down. Here's a brief clip from the episode.
We have a reflective display technology, similar to a Kindle, which was really the inspiration behind the product overall. It's really intended to be a magic piece of paper. And the reflective technology works just like everything else in nature.
What are some differences between this and a Kindle?
Kindle was the inspiration, but it was limited. It's great for reading, for turn paging, but if you try and do anything else, it's too slow. We wanted to bring a display technology that feels like digital paper, but can do more. It can do email. It can go on the internet. It can go on social media. We created a Kindle on steroids, which now means it's a healthier iPad.
All right, so if you'd like to check out Daylight for yourself, just head to daylightcomputer.com or just head to the show notes and enter code TWF50 at checkout for $50 off your order. And if you're a member of the wayforward.com, just head to the member marketplace and you'll find an even greater member exclusive discount waiting for you there. Okay, so where do we land with MLK coming into the picture just after all of this? We're just going to go chronologically because it makes sense.
Yeah, so King was born at the beginning of the so-called Great Depression. And
why do you say so-called Great Depression?
That's a different conversation entirely.
Okay. I've not gone down enough rabbit holes on that one, I guess.
Yeah, so King, even though they were in the Great Depression, King's family were well off. They were part of the so-called boule and the Black elite community there in Atlanta, Georgia. And he writes that he writes about having a relatively well-off upbringing. And his dad was a purveyor for the so-called social gospel. He writes about that in his unpublished memoir, that he is an advocate for the social gospel, which is interesting because the social gospel is not the biblical gospel. The biblical gospel is basically the fact that you and I are sinners. We're doomed to hell because of the fact that we've rejected and rebelled against God. But because God loves us, he came to us in the incarnate Christ, taught us the better way to live, taught us about the kingdom of heaven, and then he was crucified. And his being crucified, he died for our sins. He took the judgment that we are owed because of what he did. And then he died, was buried, rose again in 3 days, and ascended. And in his ascension, all of us who believe in him, we are ascended with him, and we get to enjoy paradise in heaven with God. And until then, we have a duty and obligation while we're on the earth to spread the love of Christ, to not only preach and teach the word of Christ, but also to exemplify the love of Christ. So that's, in a nutshell, what the gospel is. The social gospel is something completely different. The social gospel doesn't posit that God came to save individuals, but rather God came to revolutionize societies, to, in a sense, build a kind of heaven on earth where you have a redistribution of wealth, where you have no private ownership and all the different things that are basically Marxist. The popularizer of the social gospel was a man by the name of Walter Rauschenbusch, who lived in Hell's Kitchen, New York. And he wrote a book called Christianity and the Social Crisis after having visited London. While he was in London, he visited something called the Fabian Society. And the Fabian Society, for those who don't know, is and I'll try to say this in the most elementary way I possibly can, it's basically Marxism. However, they disagree with Marx's tactic or strategy, where Marxists called for a sudden uprising, a sudden revolution, workers of the world unite. The Fabian Society, on the other hand, believed that that's not feasible. To the extent that you have your fast-paced or sudden revolution, it's not sustainable because you still have a large part of the society who is ingrained with certain standards and culture and worldview, and they're going to forever be antagonistic to your new revolution because it's so new to them. So what the Fabian Society believed is that the best way to have a revolution is in a slow-paced way, by capturing the institutions, the schools, entertainment, the press, the church, capturing the institutions over a long period of time. And we're patient enough to know that we might not enjoy it, but at least our great-great-grandchildren will. That's what the Fabian Society believed.
Sounds like the Fabian Society had a lot of success.
Yeah,
in that
absolutely.
Respect.
So Walter Rauschenbusch was enamored by this view. So he would come back to the United States and he would pen the book Christianity and the Social Crisis, where he's advocating for basically the gospel or the Bible being utilized in the service of the Marxist agenda, because they understood that it's difficult to try to push communism on its own terms. You have to basically mask it with something. And Walter Rauschenbusch believed that you can mask it with the church. And the reason they believed this is because they had a very hard time trying to get it to spread in Europe during the 19th century. A lot of people don't know this, but Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were a contemporary to a English pastor by the name of Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon, he was a pastor at a church called the Metropolitan Tabernacle. And they're also a contemporary of Charles Darwin. They all lived in London at the same time. And so while Darwin was penning The Origin of the Species and Marx was penning the Communist Manifesto, here was Charles Spurgeon preaching the gospel. And Marx and Engels were upset at the fact that a lot of the urban poor were flocking to church as opposed to joining the revolution. And in fact, Karl Marx's daughter, Jenny Marx, there was this popular game amongst adolescents in those days called Confessions, where a youngster would make a list full of questions and then they would ask a friend questions and they would have to answer the questions. It's called Confessions. See, Jenny Marx played this game with Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx's best friend, and she asked him, who is a character you hate most? And in response to that question, Engels wrote one word, and that word was Spurgeon. They hated Spurgeon because he was an obstacle to the spreading of communism in Europe, 19th century Europe.
Was Spurgeon preaching like the gospel?
He was preaching the gospel, yes, but he was also calling out this new thought.
Got it. So he was calling out like Marxism effectively. Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting.
So they took issue with that. And so the church was an obstacle. So by the time you get to the late 19th century into the 20th century, they figured out that the way to try to spread communism in particularly Christian contexts is not to be hostile to Christianity, but to subvert it, to infiltrate it and subvert it. And so that's what the social gospel was. It's a subversion. It's an infiltration. And that was what Daddy King, Martin Luther King's father, preached. And like I said, there was an organization called the Southern Negro Youth Congress. They would put on all of these youth socials across the South, which Daddy King would frequent in his younger years. His name was Michael King. Michael King would take a trip to Germany shortly before the rise of Hitler. And he was enamored of the 16th century monk, Martin Luther. And what attracted him to Martin Luther was what he perceived to be this kind of revolution that Martin Luther led against the Catholic Church. So he wanted to do what Luther was able to do in terms of the birth of Protestantism, a breaking away from the Catholic Church. Michael King wanted to do in America with the social gospel, the breaking away from traditional Christianity, the embracing of the social gospel. He perceived himself to be the American Martin Luther. So he would come back to America, change his name to Martin Luther King, and change his son's name to Martin Luther King Jr. And so that gives you a backstory into like the kind of ideological kind of upbringing that King had. He wrote in his papers, King did, and these papers are available for anyone to purchase, I think volume 2 or 3, that he always considered himself to be the precocious type, that he rejected the fundamentalist line of Christianity. He said at the age of 12, he rejected the deity of Christ. He rejected the resurrection, that he shocked his Sunday school class at the age of 13 by rejecting the resurrection. He later rejected the virgin birth, the second coming of Christ, basically the fundamental tenets of Christianity. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because he was a Christian pastor. And
he's known as Reverend King.
Reverend King. So a pastor who doesn't believe the faith that he claims, that's interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, especially if it's not explicitly stated. Like I could see an argument where he's like, hey, here's why I think what I think, but I still consider myself a Christian, possibly. But it's more of like an obfuscation of what he truly believes under the guise of being a representation of Christianity.
100%. So he went to seminary. He went to Crozer Theological Seminary. And then from there, he continued his graduate studies at Boston University. And in those places, that's where he learned about Rauschenbusch and all of the other leftist theologians. And he learned also about the Hegelian dialectic. And he believed that he could actually synthesize. So for those who don't know, and I'm sure your audience does, for those who don't know what the Hegelian dialectic is, in King's context, was taking the synthesis of the scriptures and the antithesis of communism and trying to break that tension with the synthesis of the social revolution or social gospel or social justice. In fact, he created this. He didn't create it, but he would talk about this false dichotomy. He didn't call it a false dichotomy, but I recognize it as one of communism or social justice, as if there's a difference between the two. Social justice is the redistribution of resources and wealth, the universal income, just on and on I can go. So he's advocating for the policies without calling it communism. He would become subservient to his handler and advisor, ghostwriter, speechwriter, PR person for all intents and purposes by the name of Stanley Levison, who was an atheist. He was ethnically Jewish. That is to say, he wasn't black. So I'm not sending any dog whistles or anything here. Yeah, so he's atheist, not black. And what's interesting about Levison is he was the number one financier for the Communist Party. He owned numerous businesses, very well off, very well read. He held 2 law degrees. And he was writing for a publication called The Churchman shortly before working with King. Now, why is that interesting for an atheist to be working with a publication called The Churchman? Well, it goes back to the 1930s because the Communist Party in the 1930s, which was led by a man by the name of Earl Browder, was basically leading this effort to subvert and infiltrate the churches. They infiltrated Catholic and Protestant seminaries and Catholic and Protestant churches. This is well written. This is well documented by people like J.B. Matthews, who was a part of the Communist Party but then defected. He wrote in a publication called The American Mercury, where he basically blew the whistle about how the communists were infiltrating churches, how they were infiltrating universities, how they were getting at the top of places like Columbia University, University of Chicago, so on and so forth. He basically spilled the beans on all of it. It was also documented by a woman by the name of Bella Dodd, who wrote a book called School of Darkness. It was her memoir. She confided in a Catholic priest by the name of Fulton Sheen, who also wrote about it. So this is very well documented at what the communists were up to. And so what Stanley Levison was doing was basically following suit. He was working with the churchmen, and then as King was coming to prominence, he would then work with King. There was also a man by the name of Bayard Rustin, who was a communist strategist that worked with him. There was somebody named Clarence B. Jones, who was an entertainment attorney out of California, who also worked with King. He was the one who would send women to King's motel room whenever King would travel. There were, who else? Ella Baker, who was a social justice leftist radical. She was part of King's strategist team and speechwriters. There was Jack Odell. And then there was a man by the name of James Jackson. James Jackson was a leader of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, and he's the one who basically staffed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was King's organization, with a bunch of communist ministers. And what was interesting about that is anytime King would be asked by the press whether there were communists in his organization, he would just tell them flat out, no, our bylaws don't allow for it. So he was lying to the public, knowing full well that he was working with these people.
Right.
And not only
intimately.
that. Yeah, intimately. And not only that, that's important to note because him denying any affiliation with communists was par for the course when it came to the fact that we were living during the so-called Cold War period where the average American was anti-communist. And they wouldn't embrace or accept King if they knew that he was affiliated with them. So that was why it was important for him to vehemently come out against communism in public, but in secret, he was working intimately with them. And there was a direct line of communication between the Soviet Union and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so they were using the issue of race as a kind of cover to push a kind of Sovietization in America. And so that's why, like with me, with my studies, I have to do 2 things at once. On the one hand, I had to look at the reality of what race relations were like prior to the Civil Rights Movement. And then 2, I had to look at what the Civil Rights Movement was really up to. Because the question that always presents itself after I share the truth about who King was is, well, be that as it may, didn't we need somebody to come and try to fix the racial injustices that existed?
Like did the ends justify the means?
Yeah, did the ends justify the means? And I don't take this kind of utilitarian approach to it because what I'm more interested in is reformation, not revolution. Reformation is a slower and gradual process, but in that slower and gradual process, there's a character building component to it that is sustainable. Revolution is not sustainable because it can implode. It's built on lies and propaganda and hoaxes and deception and manipulation. It's built on those things, and the chickens will soon come home to roost.
Well, and the thing about revolutions too is it creates a sort of vacuum that allows for someone that's just as crazy, that's just as unhealed, that's just as immoral to step in and take the place.
Yeah, it's fertile soil for demagoguery. And so for me, it's like, when I look at the upward mobility of Blacks prior to the Civil Rights Movement, where you had the simultaneous kind of falling away of certain Jim Crow laws, you had a kind of building up of communities and family formation and sustainability. We were, and again, putting into practice the teachings of people like Booker T. Washington, and we had the dual benefit of self-improvement and the maintaining of a small government to some degree. We were a trying race. But what King did is he moved us from a trying race to a crying race. We learned how to cry. We learned how to beg and plead and to basically, I think downstream of the Civil Rights Movement, and this isn't just exclusive to Blacks, we learned how to complain for political leverage. We now live in an era of who can complain the most.
Who's the biggest victim?
Who's the biggest victim? What's the squeakiest wheel? And so gone are the days where a man or a woman was able to become successful, whatever that means to any given individual, through conventional means by what they're willing to do and what they're willing to put forward. We now live in a generation where we're so dependent on politics, on laws, on, and it's pervasive. It's far beyond just, political clout. It's also too I remember growing up, both of my grandmothers had huge gardens in their backyard. We weren't dependent so much on grocery stores, and we weren't dependent on, all the different things that in our society make us fatten calf for the slaughter. You know what I mean? And so we move, like what you get with the 1960s into the 70s is what I call the age of indulgence. And you can see it in the real metrics in terms of the number of children the average family is having, in terms of the rates by which we're getting married, in terms of the extent to which children are reading at grade level and doing math at grade level. On and on I can go. It wasn't just King, it was all the social justice movements, whether you're talking about gay liberation, second wave feminism, the free love movement, the hippie movement. The CIA was complicit. The FBI was complicit. The Soviet Union were complicit. You had all of these psyops going on, and they seemed new and novel, and it was just like the spirit of the age. And we bought into it because the promise was rainbows and butterflies and streets paved with gold. And a lot of the radicals of that era became college professors and teachers. And so they put on suits and ties. And so you're still getting a lot of that education today. A lot of them retreated to communes. And those communes don't exist today, but they're teaching they don't exist today because they failed, many of them. But in spite of their failure, they went on and they're still teaching those same values or devalues,
I would say,
to our youngsters today. So I know I said a lot. I'm all over the place, but
no, dude, this is great.
But yeah, I'm not laying it all at the feet of the Civil Rights Movement. I think the Civil Rights Movement was just just a component of this larger engine that was happening in that time in our country.
Yeah. So it's sufficient to say in your research then that MLK, this is almost a rhetorical statement, MLK is not the person that the overwhelming majority of people thought he was, and especially not the Black community.
I know it's a rhetorical question, but it's actually absolutely true. I mean, King was, and I say this not to be provocative, but he was a degenerate. He genuinely was, but he was very charming. He was a great orator. He was an extraordinary mimic. He can mimic anyone and sound just like them. He was funny. There's a lot of redeeming qualities about King. But like I said, he just couldn't control himself. He lacked self-control. He would participate in extramarital affairs and,
all the time,
and orgies and drinking and I hear drugs, although that's not completely proven. But the issue that the feds were having is that they were afraid that King was a liability to the movement. A lot of people believe that the FBI didn't want the civil rights movement to exist. They wanted to end it. They wanted to eradicate it. That J. Edgar Hoover was just this flaming racist. But that's not actually true. If you look at the internal memos in the FBI, they wanted the movement to exist because they understood that they can use the movement to expand their own power, to expand their own authority. This goes back to the 1930s under FDR, and it goes even back still to the Reconstruction era. The feds had a vested interest in seeing the success of social justice movements because, unlike in a dictatorship or a monarchy where a king or a dictator can move unilaterally, in a democracy or a constitutional republic where you have a say in which direction your country goes, it's tougher work. And so you have to convince the public that the direction you wish to move is the right direction. How do you get the public to go the direction you wish to take them? Through social movements, through unrest, through uprisings. That's the purpose of the civil rights movement in many respects.
So they needed the civil rights movement, but they didn't like King? Was King an obstacle?
They thought King was a liability because of the extramarital affairs and the drinking and things of this nature.
So they needed someone who appeared squeaky clean while being influenced in the background, but his extramarital affairs and degeneracy had become too rampant where it was too obvious?
Yes. If you look at the pictures from when they did the March on Washington, because the civil rights leaders went to the White House, you'll see next to John F. Kennedy, A. Philip Randolph.
Okay.
A. Philip Randolph was the one that Kennedy himself wanted to lead the movement. King is actually pictured kind of off to a distance. They were afraid that, like, if the public found out about King's infidelity and all the rest of it, that it would bode badly for the Kennedy administration, for the feds. And so this is why they wanted to remove him. The communists insisted that King be the leader. And the reason they wanted him to be the leader is because, they've been trying to get access since the 1920s.
To the black community?
To the black community, yes. They tried it originally under a star, a celebrity by the name of Paul Robeson and Langston Hughes, who was a poet out of the Harlem Renaissance. And they were only able to get but so far. They even tried it under A. Philip Randolph, who was a labor activist. He was only able to get but so far. But with King, now we have somebody. Because the interesting thing about King is not only is he this extraordinary orator, but like in the black church, you have this kind of captive audience because the majority of blacks in the South were churchgoers. So you have a captive audience. And if you can subvert the gospel with this great orator who is preaching the gospel of revolution, you are able to magnify and to really push your movement forward. And so they were having a lot of success under King that they didn't have prior with his predecessors. And so they insisted that King be the leader. So you had this tension. If you look at the predecessor of the civil rights movement under King, it was called the National Negro Congress. The National Negro Congress was started in the 1930s out of a commission set forth by FDR. The Soviet Union, specifically Joseph Stalin, helped start the National Negro Congress. So you had the feds and you had the Soviet Union working together with the National Negro Congress. Philip Randolph and I forget the other guy's name. He was the running mate to Earl Browder. He was also a black man. The two of them were the leaders of this of the National Negro Congress. And the black man who helped A. Philip Randolph was high up in the Communist Party USA. So you had the feds and the Soviet Union long working together with civil rights, but they disagreed on who should lead the movement. But both of them had a vested interest in the centralization of power. They had shared goals. They just disagreed. So sometimes they were working wittingly with each other. Sometimes they were working unwittingly with each other, the communists and the feds. And it's interesting because a lot of people believe that the FBI sent King a suicide letter telling him to kill himself. That never happened. William Sullivan, who was a special agent with the FBI, he anonymously sent King a letter and said, we know what you're up to. We know what you're doing. You have X amount of days. You know what you need to do. And a lot of people construe that as a suicide letter telling him to kill himself. They weren't telling him to kill himself. They were telling him to step down from the movement. And the days, the ultimatum that you're given is if you don't step down, we're going to release the tapes of your sexual, escapades to the public. We're going to release it to the press. That was the warning. And so when it comes to like how King was assassinated, the jury is still out on that because you have to look at motive. And of course, the government did have motive, but so too did the communists, because martyrdom is a part of their like many tactics. But yeah, King, he was a huge liability to the efforts of the feds.
So when we look at the aftermath of the civil rights movement, and I want to talk about the extended aftermath now, like in like modern times, but the immediate aftermath of federal policies that were implemented, and then also like sentiments amongst the general public that would lend credence to more centralization of power, whether directly or other policies that may have come down the line indirectly influenced by the civil rights movement and King that led to more centralization of power. Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah. And it continues to this very day. I mean, right now they're trying to push something called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which seeks to, for more enfranchisement and more, government power centralization. The federalization of elections, even. I mean, that goes into the centralization of power. So yes, in the immediate aftermath of King's assassination, there were a bevy of bills going into the 80s. Even you had President Ronald Reagan, who initially was reluctant to sign the bill, which would turn King into a national holiday, was initially reluctant to sign the bill, but he was convinced to do so by George Herbert Walker Bush, his vice president, who was a former member of the CIA. So again, like this whole business of federal expansion, it's not just a Democrat thing. It's Republicans and Democrats who are trying to grow the power of the federal government. And it's interesting because we just had this No Kings protest with a lot of people who believe that Trump is acting unilaterally. He's acting like a king. And it's like, we've been getting that with Democrat and Republican
both sides, exactly.
Since
like King. I don't disagree with you, but your whole premise is based on like, oh, we want our king in that place.
That's exactly it. So yeah, and it's so we are operating like statists. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. We are conditioned to be statists. We are conditioned to look first and foremost to politics as a solution to practical problems, and that's thanks in large part to this civil rights movement, this indulgence era. Where we used to have debates over states' rights versus federal authority. That used to be a common thing. In fact, that was a debate that was being had in Congress in 1963, a legitimate, robust debate, states' rights versus federal authority. And John F. Kennedy had civil rights legislation on his desk. He just wasn't ready to present it to Congress because of that debate that was raging. So what King and Stanley Levison did was they underwent a slew of demonstrations in order to create the perspective or the image of instability at the state and local level. So they wanted to do something called a children's crusade. And so they were trying to find places in the South to do this children's crusade. Basically, there's this age-old communist tactic where you do a peaceful demonstration. And this goes back to the 1920s. When you do a peaceful demonstration, and that verbiage in itself is misleading, because we are a country of free speech. You have the right to free speech. We're also a country of law and order. So you have to go through the proper channels to do your demonstration, because you still have to account for traffic. You have to account for noise. There's things you have to account for. So you can pull a permit, you can do your demonstration, and the police will protect you in your demonstration. So what labor unions were doing in the 1920s and 30s is they would strategically and purposefully not pull a permit. They would do their demonstration, they would do their parade, and they will get arrested for parading without a permit. Now, when that would happen, these jails, they weren't very large. When those jails filled up, they then have to resort to other means to dispersing the crowd, which included dogs, which included hoses. You can see archival footage, and we have this footage in my studio, archival footage of them dispersing entirely white crowds with dogs, hoses, batons, things of this nature.
Wow, because the narrative that up until literally this point, I've thought that was specifically to target Black people.
Nope. So you can see these white crowds, white women and children being dispersed with dogs and hoses. 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so this was already a tactic that was being utilized. And so what King and Leveson and other civil rights leaders were doing was just putting into practice things that have already been done. They wanted to do it specifically with children. And so they were going to places like Albany, Georgia, and others, trying to find a place to do this. But because the police chiefs understood that this was a tactic, they were prepared for it. So I forget what the police chief's name from Albany, Georgia, but he basically got together with other local towns and said, look, King and his crusade, they're going to come, they're going to do this. Please make space in your jail because I don't want to have to utilize these methods of dispersing the crowd. So sure enough, King came through. They had a place in jail to put these people, and nothing ever broke out that was newsworthy. But then they decided to go to Birmingham, Alabama, where the police commissioner was a man by the name of Eugene Bull Connor, who apparently didn't get the memo, and he was unprepared. And so they did their children's crusade. They filled the jails on day one. They called that D-Day. The next day, they had what they called Double D-Day. They knew the jails were filled. And then King, specifically Stanley Leveson, informed the press. Of course, they showed up in large numbers with their cameras ready to go. And sure enough, like clockwork, the dogs and the hoses break out. The media and the press, they capture it. They put it on the front page of your newspapers and your articles, or in television at this time, because television was a novel thing at that point. These images go out across the country. It caused a shockwave. And that was the ripe time for Kennedy to then introduce his legislation to Congress. He would do that a couple months later because there was other things that were going on, like I think in Little Rock, Arkansas. So that was the perfect time. The purpose of of doing these demonstrations is to make the towns and states look incapable of self-governance.
Right.
If there's unrest, if there's, you have people like Bull Connor acting foolishly who didn't have his wits about him. If you have those images go out, that causes, that emotes the public. We need something to be done about this now. We need federal action right now. And of course, John F. Kennedy introduces the legislation. John F. Kennedy wasn't a communist, but again, when you look at the agencies that were behind the executive branch and you look at a lot that was going on at the time, the objective was, once again, to expand federal authority. And sure enough, that's what his legislation would do, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the rest is history.
Wow, man. So I want to play for the listeners and viewers a trailer from your piece on MLK, if we could.
Okay.
And yeah, we'll talk after that.
After all they've been through, is there any group of people with more cool, with more swag than Black Americans?
Black folks keep saving this country, keep putting their lives on the line to save this country.
America doesn't deserve the grace we continuously give it.
Many blacks today egotistically and really naively take pride in the fact that they belong to a race that they believed laid the blueprint for how activism should be done in America.
Our generation was not good business people. That's not what we did. We were good civil rights people.
We've always been the glue that kept this country together.
And they do this for no other reason than the fact that the presumptive head of the civil rights movement happened to be a black man, Martin Luther King.
Stanley Leveson was always in his ear. Always in his ear.
Leveson was a secular Jew who was committed to the idea of social justice. He wrote everything that MLK said publicly.
I have a brief statement that I will read.
His sermons have been published in book form under the titles Stride Toward Freedom and Strength
He
to
ghost
Love.
wrote every book and article published under King's name.
Dr. King knew that Stanley was a communist, but since he too shared in Leveson's Marxist sensibilities, he was all too willing to accept the leadership of Leveson.
This time I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation.
Our leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Our leader, Dr. King.
Our leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Dr. King was our leader.
He was a pastor, right?
Marxists wrote King's speeches so well that even conservatives were duped.
The I Have a Dream speech, right? One of the great speeches in American rhetorical history.
He supported these ideas, particularly of the founders in the Declaration of Independence.
Reverend King, I'd like to prevail on you in behalf of my wife, my 2 young daughters, and myself, who are trying to operate a business here to encourage your nonviolent army to peacefully solicit some other property other than mine.
I'm not gonna be begging to give you my money. If you look at your Bible in the book of Corinthians, 11 people will not ever enter the kingdom of heaven, and one is extortioner.
We have some dear white friends here who are with us, and we want to eat together.
What's the extortioner? Uses stress, intimidation to get what they want. What was the civil rights movement?
Freedom only comes through consistent agitation.
Threats, coercion.
Just giving the Negro an equal break is not enough.
I'm gonna bring the government down here and put a gun to your head.
We still have Martin Luther King holiday in America. Every major city has a Martin Luther King Boulevard.
The downfall of blacks has more to do with a mindset shift that was brought about by political rhetoric than anything else.
The civil rights leaders were making us believe as black folks that white ice is colder.
Okay, so if people want to watch the rest of your piece on MLK, can you describe it a little bit more than just what was shown in the trailer, actually?
Yeah, so the MLK project, it was supposed to be a feature-length documentary. And it's a project that I've wanted to make for a long time, just to kind of give the backstory and to really flesh things out and to recontextualize the history. And so when I set out to make it, it's a completely independent endeavor. When I set out to make it, I was just, basically I traveled the country, I interviewed the people I wanted to interview, and I already had the B-roll and the archival footage that I've been collecting for years. And so I just came back and I just was going to edit it and try to get it cranked out in about 4 months. But as I was editing it, 2 hours became 3 hours became 4. And I looked at the timeline one day, I'm like, oh, wow, this is a pretty long thing. And I don't want a lot of it to hit the floor because all of it's relevant. Yeah. So I thought that what I would do is I would just make a long feature and just have an intermission in the middle, which is pretty unheard of when it comes to documentaries. So I just kept editing, and then that 4 hours became 5, that 5 hours became 6. And then I realized, like, this should be a docuseries. There's no way that people will sit through a documentary that long. And, you know, docuseries, they exist on, you know, platforms like Netflix and Hulu and others. So that isn't particularly novel. Kim Burns does it on PBS. So we broke it up into episodes, and we have 2 seasons. And what we do is we get into the backstory, not only of the civil rights movement, but of Western civilization in general, because it's difficult to make sense of King and the civil rights movement and what they were doing, the nefarious things they were doing, without giving the backdrop of what it was they were coming against, if that makes sense. Yeah. So we look at Western civilization in episode 1, and part of episode 2, we look at American history, and we really don't even get to King till probably like episode 5 or 6 and the MLK Project season 1. Yeah, I mean, it's important because a lot of the ideas and a lot of the views that came out of the civil rights movement, as it pertains to race relations, as it pertains to what the responsibility of the government is, a lot of these things are antithetical to Western civilization. That's not to say that Western civilization is inherently racist. It just means to say that Western civilization and our Constitution does the best that it can in terms of safeguarding individual liberty, which is important because out of the civil rights movement, you get things that are antithetical to Western civilization because it creates protected classes. And in the protection of classes, you get resentment, you get instability, and all sorts of other things. Western civilization and our Constitution does the best in terms of, how should I word this? Respecting the way that mankind is wired and respecting one's right to freedom of association. And those points are very difficult to make without giving the backstory, without giving the backdrop. We as human beings, we're naturally tribalistic. We flock with people who are like-minded, and it's your right to do that. The problem is when that becomes violent. The problem is when I'm, whenever I'm threatening you or whatever the case may be. And so we should have basic laws of I'm not allowed to steal your property or kill you or whatever the case may be.
Anything that safeguards an individual's property and their bodily autonomy.
Their bodily autonomy, yeah. And so it's a very difficult question and a complex question when it comes to civil rights. Because what is a civil right? What does that mean? Initially, civil rights was looked at as the protection of personal property, but then it became something completely different. So yeah, when you look at it, for example, the sit-ins and protesting the lunch counters and things of this nature, I'm of the belief that if a storekeeper or a restaurant owner wants to discriminate in terms of how they hire, who they fire, who they serve, things of this nature, they should have the right to do that through the freedom of association. They should have the right to associate how they please. There shouldn't be a state level law which forces that business that you built to have a separate door for Negroes, to, force Negroes into the balcony or whatever the case may be. That's infringement, right? That violates your freedom of association. Nor should there be a federal law that forces you to serve people who you don't want to serve or hire people who you don't want to hire. So you have the state that's acting tyrannically, and you have the feds who are acting tyrannically. So the solution is not, state sanctioned segregation, nor is it federally enforced integration. It's allowing the individual, especially if you put in the blood, sweat, and tears to start the business, if you took out the loans, if you took on the burden and counted the cost to start the business, you should be able to run that business how you see fit. And if you're only serving certain kinds of people, let the free market decide. They will decide whether your business should stay in business or not. And the free market will make the decision. That's not a philosophical thing. It's just a common sense thing as far as I'm concerned.
Hey, y'all. I'm here with Melissa Kupsch from Remedy Academy of Homeopathy. We are so stoked here at The Way Forward to be partnering with Melissa and Remedy in order to spread the message of homeopathy across the world, and also to partner on the eventual development of healing centers across the United States.
People are pretty quickly coming to realize that frequency is the future of medicine. We are witnessing the great resurgence of homeopathy right now. We're really moving away from that suppressive medical model, whether it's for eczema, asthma, hormones, fertility, anxiety, depression, trauma, whatever it is, it all starts as energy in the person's field first. If we change our field, we can completely change our life. Our 2-year academy is open worldwide to anyone who wants to become a homeopath. We've got 5 lecturers and we currently have over 500 students enrolled, which is record numbers in our field. A career in homeopathy is amazing for anyone who wants flexibility in their work and who wants to be valuable in creating this new world. We have stay-at-home parents enrolled. We have ex-medical professionals, grandparents signed up who want to learn how to heal their grandchildren and pass on that invaluable knowledge. We even have husband and wife teams. So my husband enrolled in the course with no prior knowledge of health as a background, and he is loving it.
Kylie is also enrolled as well. So my partner is, and she's so stoked to become a homeopath and to be helping to spread this message across the world.
The thing that we hear from so many of our students is, I found my thing. Homeopathy is the key. We harness frequencies from nature and we alter the field of all creations. So if anybody wants to join us or they want to know more about it, they can visit our website.
Yeah, and all that information will be in the show notes. So if you want to learn more about Remedy Academy, also Remedy Collective, also some of the homeopathic products that they have, please just head to the show notes. All of that will be listed there. This is a question I want to bring up then, because you brought up capitalism, and you wouldn't consider yourself a capitalist?
No.
Okay, I want to hear about this a little bit more, because in my current understanding right now, always open and changing my mind, a lot of people who rail against capitalism, it's another example of a straw man. What we have right now, I would not consider true free market capitalism. It's crony capitalism with, a lot of multinational corporations. With
it's corporate socialism.
Yeah, it's corporate socialism. Exactly. It's not actual capitalism, but you have a problem with the term capitalism itself as well?
Yeah, because of those last 3 letters. ISM.
Ism. Okay.
Which connotes a doctrine.
Okay, that's fair.
A belief.
That's fair.
The pursuit of capital above all else. One doesn't have to be a capitalist to be wealthy or to just have the gift of making money.
Yeah. Or to be a good entrepreneur.
Or to be a good entrepreneur. To me, when I think of capitalist, I think of somebody who like the pursuit of capital as a doctrine, the pursuit of capital above all things. For them, it is a religion. There are people like that. Yeah, there are a lot of people who exist like that.
That's true.
And so this false dichotomy of communism versus capitalism is one that I reject. I do believe in the free market system, the free market economy.
A true free market.
A true free market economy with the emphasis on free. Now, that's not as romantic as it sounds. Because in a free market, like anything that, like freedom takes work and it takes maturity, quite frankly. The system that I just described, where a person has a right to discriminate with their business and with their affairs as they see fit, it takes a mature society in order for that to work. Because I, as a Negro, as a Black man, if somebody doesn't want to serve me, I should be mature enough to go and patronize their competitor or start my own business instead of just being offended that this person doesn't want to serve me. I would want to know if they are prejudiced against Black folks, because I don't want my food being spat in. You know what I mean? Or my coffee, like I don't want extra stuff in my coffee.
Like smiling to your face.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're extorted and they're coerced to serve me by the government, and they're doing so begrudgingly, and I get a little bit more protein in my food that I didn't ask for. So I'd rather know that about you than to spend my money with somebody who doesn't share my values. That requires a degree of maturity. If I work for somebody who is not honoring or respecting my labor or what have you, I have the freedom to roll up and to go work for somebody else or to start my own business. That's the way it should be in a free market economy. When it comes to so let's talk a bit about the difference between a capitalist and somebody who is a good entrepreneur who doesn't pursue capital above all else. The difference is that the person who's just gifted at or a good steward of the things that they have, they'll be treating their customers well, their employees well, maybe giving them good benefits. They just run their business with a degree of integrity and principles, quite frankly. They are charitable. They are doing things out of their own volition, not because they're coerced to do so by the government, right? Those people exist. I know many of them. I wouldn't call them capitalists. What we've seen with those who are truly capitalists, by the definition of the word, is this pursuit of capital kind of reverberating across the board as far as how they conduct business. And we've seen this happen in real time. We've seen this in terms of how cars are manufactured. It used to be the case that cars are made to last, right? 20, 30 years. And now cars are made to break down and yeah. So you're ever and perpetually in the market for a new car or to lease a new car, what have you. We see this in home building. Houses today are built and with cheap materials. You're constantly having to call the maintenance man or the repairman. The way things are made these days are made to break down. They're not made to last. We see this in the pharmaceutical industry, right? Ailments are not being treated. They're not getting to the root of them, even though we have the capability to do so. We're pumping people with pills. You're constantly having to go back to the pharmacist to get more pills. We're fatter. I know I want to talk.
You look all right, dude.
We're unhealthy. And so it's like, so that capital kind of driven motive has had a negative impact. And you have to be a communist to admit that. And so those people exist. What do you do about those people? There's a different answer depending on who you ask. The communist says we should seize their wealth. We should imprison them. We should, depending on which communist you ask. And we've seen over the course of the 20th century, these people lined up against walls and shot. We've seen them, relegated to the gulags. We've seen the whole gamut of things that happens to these people under the communist system. What the free market system says is simply don't buy their goods and services. That's what you have the freedom to. And again, that freedom requires maturity. You have to be mature enough to, I don't like what this person is doing with their business. I don't like the way that they're conducting their business. I'm not going to buy their goods and services. What has happened was what you call the crony piece, where you have these companies that are too big to fail, as it were, because the government makes them so. You saw this happening under FDR. You see all this happening under Obama. You see this happening time and again, where you have this kind of corporate socialism that's taking place. And so for me, it's like I refuse to pick a side, communism or capitalism, because I reject both. I do believe that the free market system is the best economic system for a free society, but I don't conflate free market economics with quote unquote capitalism.
I like that.
And I know it's semantics at the end of the day, But there is a distinction to acknowledge.
No, for sure. And I think that there is an argument to be made that a lot of the complaints from those who are communists and Marxists bring up about capitalism are true. But again, they're under the guise of like fighting what I would consider crony capitalism. They're also like trying to establish more centralized power in the pursuit of that. But what they're talking about, how corporations exploit others for profit, how they manipulate others for profit, that is true. That is true. So I would agree with you in that respect. Do you have a name for it yet, or?
No, I mean, I know free market enterprise is not as catchy.
Yeah, right.
But
I would call myself that then too. I think everything that you just described, I would 100% agree with. Yeah, I completely agree. I'd like to get to when we look at Black culture now. I know I had alluded to it briefly before. The results of the civil rights movement and how it has impacted the Black community across the United States and what that looks like. I'd just love to hear it from your perspective.
Yeah. So the Black community or Black culture or any of these other buzz phrases that we use, it's a concoction that was made in a Hollywood basement, to put it frankly. If you look at like archival photos, such as I have, you'll notice something interesting when you look at like Black home videos in the 1940s and 50s, or if you look at images of Black folks dating as far back as the 1910s. And if you look at those photos and you compare them to photos of white folks, you notice no distinguishable difference. They wore the same, they dressed the same, they spoke the same, they had the same degree of elegance, and even in the rural areas, they had the same dialect and the same way of carrying themselves and the same mannerisms. This existed, again, for the better part of the 20th century. As you get into the 60s and into the 70s, you see this kind of emerging, what they call Black power movement that was happening. And they were insisting on Blackness as a subculture. And the interesting thing about that is it was meant from its very inception to be hostile to Western civilization. You get James Brown, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. You get King in the late 60s, yes, I'm Black and beautiful. You get, again, this emphasis on Black. As you get into the 70s, you see it kind of permeating into dress. And now we're going to start wearing dashikis and afros, and we're going to start naming our children interesting names and all this. You see this insistence on being a subculture. We don't want to be quintessentially American. We want to be something different. We want to be something set apart, as it were. The term African American was actually popularized by Jesse Jackson in the 1980s, during the same decade that he ran for president. And what's interesting about that is during the same decade where he popularized the term African American, he was marching down the campus at UC Berkeley or Stanford, I forget which one, chanting, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. Basically coming out against Western civilization at the same time that he's insisting that we are not American, we're African-American. And so when you look at what Black isn't just an ethnicity. Black is a political statement. And sure, a lot of people like to say, well, as Blacks, we're not a monolith. Well, that might be true in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of a whole bevy of things, whether you come from a more rural background or urban background, that might be true. But when it comes to voting season, election season, I mean, we sure as hell prove that we are a monolith because we vote 80+% for the same party. When it comes to the Cato Institute study that was conducted in 2019, which asked people of different ethnicities which they favor, socialism or capitalism, that false dichotomy again, more Blacks had a more favorable view of socialism. The majority of Blacks had a more favorable view of socialism. All other ethnic groups, whites, Hispanics, Asians, favored capitalism more than socialism. Blacks were the only ethnic group in the country that had a higher view of socialism. And so when it comes to like political identity, there is a monolith. There is a kind of overwhelming majority, if you will. And so that was done on purpose from the 60s into the 70s, and it's stuck ever since. And again, you see a CIA involvement in it. You see the civil rights participation in it. You see the Black militant participation in it. You see the entertainment class and their participation in it. which is interesting because if you go back to the 1920s during the so-called Harlem Renaissance, out of Harlem with the arts and the poems and the jazz and all that, you had Langston Hughes, who was working hand in hand with a white art critic by the name of Carl Van Vechten out of Chicago. He went to the University of Chicago, at least, and they called him the tastemaker. He would move to Harlem. He would frequent the saloons in Greenwich Village. He was part of the Greenwich Village kind of like elite society. There's a woman by the name of Mabel Dodge Lujan. She was in Greenwich Village, but then she moved to Taos, New Mexico. That's where she gets the last name Lujan because she married a Native American there. And she wrote a book called Movers and Shakers where she talked about those days in the 1920s where she would have all of these thinkers come together in her apartment and they would talk about the revolution that needs to take place. You had Max Eastman. You had John Reed, who I mentioned earlier. You had Walter Lippmann, who I'm not sure if you know who Walter Lippmann is. So Walter Lippmann wrote a book called Public Opinion in 1922. Okay. He was an advisor to numerous politicians. Okay. He believed that people are incapable of self-governance and that we need an expert class, a bureaucracy, to show them which way to go. He called the public the bewildered herd who is in desperate need of a bureaucratic expert class. So that's who Walter Lippmann was. He was a very famous journalist in the 20th century. So, and two, although he wasn't part of this Greenwich Village group, there was, of course, John Dewey, who we call the grandfather of public education as well. He was teaching at Columbia at the time. So anyway, when you look at Van Vechten, he was a tastemaker. He would go into Black Harlem, and Langston Hughes would help Van Vechten scout up-and-coming Negro artists, and then he would connect them with these well-moneyed white liberals, many of whom were women. They called them Miss Anne. There's a book called Miss Anne in Harlem, which documents some of these women. And they were very interested in the Black arts. And they would bankroll a lot of these artists. They would basically try to give these artists, like, here's the image I want for you to project in your art. So harken back to the African jungle. So they were basically shaping and molding these Black artists to basically do their bidding in the arts. And
sounds like the music industry now, by the way.
Precisely. So a lot of these artists, and they were complicit. I mean, yes, they were puppets, but at the same time, they were voluntary puppets.
They were useful.
They were useful.
Yeah.
And they wanted to be rich and famous. So of course they obliged. And what's interesting about that is the Black community rejected this. You can look at the editorial portions of the newspaper, or not the editorial portions, the public feedback portions of the newspaper in those days. And you see all these notes that were being written by Blacks saying, hey, this doesn't represent me. I don't know any Black person that acts like that.
Yeah.
So they were rejecting it. But of course, what's interesting about that is if you are a white person who lives in middle America, you've never seen a Negro in your life, or you live up in the upper West Coast, you never seen Blacks in your life, but you open your newspaper, you see this musician, this poet, this artist, you listen to them, like you only see Blacks on the silver screen or through a record. Of course, your imagery of what Black people are like and what people, what they want and what their grievances are is going to be shaped by what you see through the kind of the pseudo narrative, if you will. And so this would continue into the 60s and, of course, the 70s, and then it will really take a hold. And then, of course, it will permeate into the hip hop industry and so on. And that's not to say, once again, that, like, I'm not trying to say that they didn't know any better or they didn't.
They're exploited, though.
They were exploited, yes, but they were fully willing to participate.
What about the war on drugs? I know, like, this is an abrupt change in subject, right?
Yeah.
But I don't imagine that pre-civil rights movement, the drugs and drug dealing was pervasive amongst Black communities. Or maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, you had heroin and cocaine and...
Yeah, but that was also used amongst, like, whites just as much, from my understanding, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was. But the thing is, like, when you look at the 60s and the 70s, like the reefer and all that. This was something that was part of that indulgence culture. It was very much a part of it. And you had a lot of people who indulged. I mean, like with the Black community, of course, there's the rumors that, Reagan had something to do with, polluting the Black community with
intentionally polluting the Black community
crack and yeah. And I think the jury is still out on that. And again, I'm not a Reagan sycophant. Like, I don't believe that he's next to God. There's a lot
he
of
definitely signed the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And
there you go.
There's a number of things.
There's a lot of things that Reagan did that I completely disagree with, including the signage of this bill that turned King into a national holiday. But I digress. But the fact of the matter is, whether that's true or not, at the end of the day, you have a decision to make as to whether you're going to buy drugs or not. So what's interesting to me is, like, anytime we approach this particular conversation, whether it's the war on drugs or whether it's, the man in the house rule out of the Johnson administration, everybody talks about Blacks as if they're this kind of inanimate object who doesn't have self-agency, is incapable of making responsible decisions. And the reality is, like, I'm not going to treat Blacks like a victim, like they're this, like, oh, woe is me, they're their little boy. You didn't know that, getting addicted to crack would be bad for you. Like, we have to stop it. The fact of the matter is, there are different things about different cultures that will either have, work to their benefit or work to their detriment. And there's a lot of decisions that Blacks made by and large that work to their detriment, right? And the responsibility is now on you as to whether you're going to turn that around or not. And you're not going to turn that around by the passing of a lot of legislation, a lot of laws that are meant to artificially, bring you up. That's going to happen by hard work. And you're going to have to start. Like, I know too many Hispanic people who came here who busted their ass, cleaning toilets, working construction, whatever the case may be. And their children are able to be well off. They go into filmmaking. They go into, being a doctor or whatever the case may be. Like, that happens conventionally from generation to generation. And that's been happening long in this country, including with Black people, to the extent that we, again, went from being a trying race to a crying race, where we took our hand off the proverbial plow and we instead picked up the picket sign because we believe that picket sign will get us liberation and freedom and equality and all the things. And we began to look to some kind of outside source to give us liberation, to give us freedom. It then makes sense that, and on the back of that, you get more Blacks hooked on welfare, that you get the drug situation, the fathers leaving the home, because, idle hands are the devil's playground. You know what I mean? Like, when you feel sorry for yourself, it's not rocket science. Like, all these vices and stuff are kind of par for the course. And so,
lack personal responsibility when you're constantly blaming other people, pointing the finger at everyone else.
Right.
That allows the devil to come in and influence you.
There you go.
You're never at fault.
There you go. And so it's like, for me, like, I grow tired of all of these sociologists and cognitive scientists and social scientists who are trying to, identify the problem and trying to, say, well, if we do this and if we pass this law and if we give them this and give them that, that's going to solve the problem. And we can look no further than places like West Baltimore and South Side of Chicago, all these places where these things were implemented, and those places are actually worse off. And so the reality is that the only thing that will turn that around as a Christian, I believe, is repentance. And then, undergoing the conventional means of becoming relatively successful, whatever that means for you, but you can't break the law. You can't be a degenerate. You can't be an anarchist. Like, you have to have principles, and principles is the only thing that's going to turn it around. It's not government legislation.
100% agree with that. The thing that where it gets interesting is, like, when we look at how much the Black community, and again, that's a very general term, and it is almost speaking about it like, I don't ever say the white community, you know what I mean? Like, I could see where it's like both a monolith and not a monolith. Like, but speaking generally to the Black community, how much the programming has infiltrated the Black community surrounding, you are always going to be less than the white person. You're always going to have to work harder than the white person. So we need to give you these benefits. Your white people are inherently racist. But then at the same time, I'll give you an example. In Kansas City, we have this thing known as the Truce Divide. On one side of the street is the average socioeconomic bracket is roughly, I think, 180,000. I don't know the exact numbers. And then on the other side of that street, it's like 30 to 40,000. One area is predominantly white. The other area is predominantly black. So when we talk about systemic racism, this looked like to me, and I don't know the details. I've not done my due diligence to know exactly how that came about. It looks like systemic racism, but I would argue now, rather than systemic racism being a thing, whether it was or wasn't, we could talk about that. I'd love to hear your thoughts. It's more of a classism. It's like a systemic classism that is a thing that Black people might be disproportionately affected by. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I've been in a lot of circles with, of course, I didn't go to college, but I've been in a lot of circles.
That's a good thing, by the way.
With
I did go to college, and I went to one of the top public universities in the United States. It means nothing.
West Point.
Yeah.
But I've been in a lot of circles with Ivy League professors and junior college professors and, people who are in graduate school and so on. And in fact, I'm going to be speaking at the University of Dallas on a panel in January. And one of the things that really kind of irks me, especially as somebody who's blue collar, like I own a plumbing company in Dallas, and I grew up in a family where my dad was an excavator. He had 13 brothers and sisters. All of his brothers are in a trade. I have an uncle who's an electrician, an uncle who works with bricks, and another who builds houses. And like they all, like I grew up watching my dad and uncles come together and building houses and adding rooms to our house and all sorts of things. So that's the environment in which I grew up. So of course, my solutions to things are always practical. But when you're in these high education environments and everybody has an opinion on how to move society forward, and it's, and they talk in the abstract and all this other nonsense. What's interesting is, even to the extent that you have conservative intellectuals who cede the fact that the issue isn't systemic racism, they then say that the real issue is classism. That's the real issue. And I'm not saying that you're doing this, but to me, it's like you're playing right back into the hands of the agitprop contingent.
Yeah, to make one subset of people victims.
Right.
Yeah, that's fair.
Exactly.
That's totally fair.
And so the reality of it is, do we live in a caste system or don't we? Right? There's a lot wrong with our society. We talked earlier about, corporate socialism and price fixing and all the other things that the government does. Every time the government involves its hand, things actually get worse. Costs go up, taxes go up, all the things. So it's becoming harder to live even in our country.
Intentional decimation of the middle class, I'd say, by the way.
Precisely. I mean, it's much harder for a young man in his 20s to buy a house in 2025 than it was in 1975, Even more recently, like even 1980s, 1990s. Exactly. So that's a problem. That's a real big problem. But to waste time focusing on classism, I don't think is an answer to the problem, because again, it's more and more victimization, which then begs for government solutions, and the government only makes matters worse. So what can we do practically to fix the issues? When it comes to, again, the reason why we're so busy talking about racism, that started with this cultural Marxist thing that we saw out of the Frankfurt School, out of the Civil Rights Movement, out of all of these different, people who are interested in the soft sciences and social engineering have done. But that is actually a kind of graduation, if you will, from what was originally an economic fight, a class struggle fight out of Marx and Engels and others. And so we went from there to the race thing, and now we're right back to the class struggle piece of it. And so, again, as I talked about earlier, when you saw the responsible Negro and white leaders out of the Reconstruction era coming up with like, okay, we now have separate but equal. You get this side of the train tracks, we'll get this side of the train tracks. You do business amongst your people, intergroup economics. We do intergroup economics on our front. occasionally we will patronize, and cross-pollinate each other's businesses. And eventually those racial barriers will break away. That was actually happening, right? But that's not indicative, in my opinion, of systemic racism. It gives you the ability to really kind of hone your resources and to really, make something of yourself in such a way that you're able to do business with others. And this wasn't just true of blacks and whites. This was also true, and I say white, it was also true of the Italians, the Catholics, the Irish. Of
course.
The Hispanics.
It's still true to this day, and no one has any issue with that.
Right, exactly. And so I don't think it's a systemic race. And then too, this whole idea that it's so sad that the blacks live over there on that side of the train track. That's such a tragedy. Underneath that is the belief that the only way a black person can feel dignified is if he has proximity to white people.
So true.
And so that in itself is white supremacist.
Right.
You know what I mean?
is.
I don't believe that I have to be next to a white person in order to feel good about myself.
Right.
That I have to, eat a cheeseburger made by white hands in order to feel like I'm an equal. I don't feel that way. I mean, you look at, again, and I have the pictures and the video archives and all of this. You had black hotels. You had black fine dining restaurants. You had black beachfront properties in California in the 1940s and 50s. You had all of this, and you had a diversity of opinions and beliefs among black folks. A lot of people falsely believe today that black people wholesale embraced what King was trying to do in the 1960s. That's not the case. There were debates, and I have the videos to prove it. There were debates being had over whether we should try to force integration or not. And there was a diversity of opinion. And so, of course, that diversity doesn't exist anymore. It's now established and enshrined that, if you're born with dark skin in America, you're automatically a part of the so-called struggle, right? There's this oral history, and that goes back to the question that you asked earlier, or the statement about, the black community and the beliefs therein. There's this kind of oral history there that you're part of the struggle. It sucks to be black in America. Imagine being a black man in America, you hear. And
that's what I was alluding to earlier. That's what you're fed.
Right. That's all you're fed from a very early age. And it's all abstract. You get it in entertainment over the course of the 2000s, early 2000s. You had movies coming out, 90s and 2000s. You had Color Purple. You had Beloved. You had all these movies, a lot of Spike Lee films. And it was just really kind of reinforcing this narrative that the struggle still exists even today. King said in his famous I Have a Dream speech, which, by the way, was written by Stanley Levison and Bayard Rustin and Clarence Jones and all, and this kind of gang of communists. He said that the Negro will never be satisfied until justice flows down like waters, and so on and so forth. So the Negro will never be satisfied. So who is it to determine when justice flowed down like waters, right? And of course, the justice that he's referring to is not biblical justice, it's social justice, which is...
I mean, a lot of people are still talking about we need reparations, 40 acres and a reel that was promised to us, and we need some of the white... I literally saw, I forget where it was, but it was a white right-leaning political commentator that was in a black barbershop. You might know who I'm talking about.
Crowder.
Yeah, Crowder. Crowder was in a black barbershop, and they were talking about, well, maybe all white people aren't wrong, but we need to find the families, the descendants of those who owned slaves, and they need to pay reparations.
Crazy.
But dude, what's crazy for me, here's what's crazy. So I'm Serbian, right?
Yeah.
I'm part Serbian. I have ancestors who were slaves. I have some ancestors, obviously they didn't have descendants because of what I'm about to say, they were eunuchs.
Mm-hmm.
I have slavery in my past too.
Right.
I'm not using that as an excuse to justify why I'm put down or anything like this.
Right.
And I do believe in generational trauma on the other hand. I do. Especially studies that have been done on mice and things like this where you it can possibly carry 6 or 7 generations, whether you want to call that epigenetically, I don't know what, some sort of thing that happens internally where that is carried inside of you down the line.
Right.
But then that begs the question, what are black people being taught today about who they are that is imprinting in them
that's what you asked.
And then passing on generationally?
Right. Yeah. And again, we moved from a trying race to a crying race. We were taught that there's political clout and complaining and crying. Even if we weren't taught this directly, we were taught it subconsciously. Who is a lot of folks, when asked who was the greatest Black poet who ever lived, they might say James Baldwin, right? Now, James Baldwin, make no doubt about it, he was very eloquent. But if you look at the substance of what he's actually saying in those poems, it was very like, woe is me. It sucks to be Black in America. And it's just very like, it's grievance porn, quite frankly. The same is true of King. It's interesting because like in my docuseries, I compare King to a very prominent Negro minister at the time by the name of Joseph H. Jackson. And what's interesting about Joseph H. Jackson is he was the president of something called the National Baptist Convention, which was the largest Black church congregation in America for the better part of the 20th century. And he came out of that kind of Booker T. Washington school of thought. An example of this is there was a time when Black sharecroppers were being cheated out of their wages. And rather than complaining to the government or protesting or anything like that, the National Baptist Congress, under the leadership of Joseph H. Jackson, decided to buy 400 acres of land in Tennessee. And they allowed these Negro sharecroppers to work the land rent-free. And the money that they raised, they were encouraged to then use that money to go start their own, to buy their own farmland. And this was proven to be successful. This was happening during a time when we were told that, oh, it was so racist and all the things. He took practical solutions that actually yielded genuine benefits. King wanted to remove Jackson from the presidency of the National Baptist Convention, and he wanted to be the president. So what he and his contingent did is, because he was so young and he realized that he wouldn't be elected, they tried to basically put up a veteran in the National Baptist Convention who was also a preacher of the social gospel by the name of Gardner C. Taylor. So they came up with this elaborate plan to remove Jackson. It didn't work. Jackson was elected anyway. King and his contingent demanded a roll call, and they rushed the stage. And in this kerfuffle, a man by the name of A.G. Wright fell off the stage, cracked his head, and died. As a result of this, King was kicked out of the National Baptist Convention in 1961, and they went on to start something called the Progressive National Baptist Convention in order to rival the National Baptist Convention. So this was kind of the difference between Jackson and King. No relation, by the way, to Jackson. So the reason I bring that up is because if you look at their preaching styles, they're completely different. Jackson, during one of his sermons, said it's up to men to be men. He said, if you're not going to be a man, then braid your hair and start wearing step-ins. But God has carefully made you. He fixed you up just right. Let men be men. And he was basically talking about the fact that a lot of the men were beginning to complain about things as a result of what was going on with the rhetoric in the civil rights movement. Whereas King, he was interviewed by NBC in Atlanta, and he said, well, men can't be men because of the conditions and because of the housing and because of the maldistribution of wealth and all the things. So you have these two completely different views on what makes a man. King ties your ability to be a man with what kind of policies the government passes, whereas Jackson believed that your ability to be a man is God-given. It's actually a responsibility to be a man. And so that's what I mean when I say we went from a trying race to a crying race, even if it is subconsciously. It wasn't Jubilee. It was, I forget the platform. But anyway, they did this kind of panel discussion with a bunch of random content creators, and they were talking about masculinity. The name is on the tip of my tongue, but Christian Walker, the son of Herschel Walker, was on this panel. There were a couple of other folks, and there was a Black man named Tahoe on it. And of course, whenever it was his turn to speak on this panel, he starts off, well, as a Black man, like he had to reference that. We can clearly see that you're Black, but he, for some reason, had to reference that. And I'm not trying to hate on the brother, but like he's talking about this, like, I don't really see masculinity in the traditional sense because as a Black man, I grew up without a father. I believe that if the woman wants to lead in the relationship, she should be able to lead. And like, he's basically saying all this stuff, and he's basically making excuses for the fact that a lot of men just don't want to be men. That doesn't mean that like if you're in a relationship, you lord authority over your wife or your girlfriend. Like, that's not what I'm advocating. But like you do have
Man
a
is the
responsibility.
leader of the home, though.
Right. You do have a responsibility to be a protector, to be
Protector,
a good leader.
provider, security, 100%.
Right. That your wife can depend on.
Yes.
Right. Because if you don't do that, then she's going to feel the need to be that authoritative person in the relationship and in the home. And that's not fair to her, you know? And so a lot of Black men feel this way, unfortunately, because of this kind of oral history that we've gotten. There was a mindset shift that took place, and that reveals itself in those metrics and those disparities. How do we go from this prior to the civil rights movement to this? You know,
was it pretty, like when we look at those metrics, is it pretty obvious that it's around that time frame?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So
again, it really was like, in essence, the civil rights movement is what led to the Black community
feeling sorry for ourselves. The thing is, the civil rights movement, what we got out of it was a whole bevy of things. You see this kind of entitlement amongst many Blacks today, this kind of race paranoia, seeing racism where there is no racism. You see this kind of smug disposition where a lot of Blacks feel that they can just be openly racist.
There's definitely double standard in that. Yeah, it's crazy.
It's say outlandish things, but then get offended if somebody is just making a coarse joke. You know what I mean? And of course, for me, like growing up in a pretty diverse setting, we were for all intents and purposes racially diverse. I mean, the school I went to was probably like 20% Black, maybe 15% Hispanic, and you know the rest were whites. And we made jokes, you know, coarse racial jokes in the locker room. I played football. It was all good. Like we would say stuff.
We did too, man. Like all the time.
But like we are like downstream of the civil rights era, and it's not just with Blacks. Like we learn how to be offended. We are the most offended generation. And I say that not just like saying millennials or whatever. Like people like to say Generation X, like we're not offended by anything. I've seen a lot of offended folks in Generation X. It's interesting with Generation X because, you know, they believe that like, oh, we're not, it's impossible for us to be duped or to be manipulated. And we're the latchkey kids. They believe that they're like just gold walking. But the reality is like, no, we've all like every generation has had its psyops, you know? And so, yeah, like from the boomers on down to alpha, like we are the most offended, you know, kind of chorus of generations. We learned how to be offended and how to be offended within a political space from that kind of indulgence era of all these social movements that were happening at the time.
Most healthcare today operates on an outdated mechanistic model, treating the body like a battlefield rather than a self-healing system. You wait months for an appointment only to receive a rush diagnosis that labels you rather than truly understanding your unique health. Even in holistic health, many practitioners rely on endless lab tests and supplement protocols, addressing symptoms instead of the root cause. And the result? Another prescription or supplement regimen that merely suppresses or masks symptoms rather than facilitating true healing, whether the imbalance was physical, emotional, energetic, or a mix of all three. And that's why Dr. Tom Cowan co-founded the New Biology Clinic, to offer something radically different. As one of the most respected natural health doctors in the world, Dr. Cowan has spent decades challenging conventional medicine and advancing a deeper understanding of human biology, water, and natural health. His work isn't just about rejecting the mainstream, it's about offering a more truthful, biologically coherent approach for healing. The New Biology Clinic recognizes that health isn't about fighting disease, it's about restoring balance. You're not a diagnosis, you're an individual with a unique story, and healing should honor that. With virtual consultations available worldwide, the clinic offers a flat-rate monthly membership that gives you direct access to practitioners who take the time to actually listen. Members also get exclusive health live streams, a resource library, and live sessions covering everything from biofield tuning and breathwork to movement and meditation, all designed to support whole body healing. And if you're not ready for a membership, you can book a one-time appointment, sign up for an enrichment-only membership for the healing modalities alone, or schedule a free connection session with one of the care team members to see how the New Biology Clinic can help in your specific situation. This isn't about keeping you dependent on doctors. It's about making you sovereign over your health. Head to newbiologyclinic.com and use code THEWAYFORWARD, and that's spelled The Way, F-O-R-W-A-R-D, for $50 off account activation, or just head to the show notes for more info. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com for $150 off. Your body already knows how to heal, and New Biology Clinic helps you remember. Yeah. Amen, man. Well said. I want to talk a little bit, if we could, about hip hop culture and how much that has negatively impacted the Black community. And I say that while also I have to be transparent here. One of my favorite artists, for example, is J. Cole, because I believe he is an incredible storyteller, and his storytelling in many ways speaks to a lot of what I experienced as a child. And I'll also say this, and I've shared this publicly, and it's fine. I grew up in a household that lived in the suburb. We lived in the suburbs, but behind the walls of our home, I related more to my Black friends because I experienced a lot of the same hardships that a lot of Black kids experienced growing up. So I related more to them, but I'm white, so I couldn't fully relate to them. Versus the kids in my neighborhood who were white didn't experience the things that I experienced. So I couldn't fully relate to them either. So I was kind of like this outcast, if you will, where I felt like I could...
No pun intended.
Yeah. Yeah.
Outkast, by the way, is one of my favorite
Okay,
groups.
I love Outkast. Yeah. Andre 3000. Yeah, 100%. But I could never fully relate to either side, but I related more in terms of my experience to my Black friends.
Right.
If that makes sense.
No, that makes sense.
And so with that, all that being said, an artist like J. Cole, I absolutely love because he speaks to a lot of the same stuff that I experienced when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
And I also recognize, and I don't think J. Cole is necessarily of this category, at least not to the degree that some other rappers are, but there are rappers out there that absolutely glamorize and glorify absolute degeneracy. Not only degeneracy, just like utter violence, like violence that is horrible, objectifying women, of course. I just love to hear your thoughts on how hip hop culture has negatively impacted the Black community.
Yeah, and it's particularly exactly what you just talked about with as far as the violence and the objectifying women piece. That is particularly the component, as far as I can tell, that has negatively impacted the so-called Black community. Because what we call hip hop culture, I mean, if you go back to the 30s and 40s and 50s, I mean, you had blues. Blues is kind of a storytelling art in itself. So too is
rhythmic as well. And that like some of the blues songs back then actually sound like they're rapping a little bit.
Right.
Which is interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. But then too, I mean, if you look at, some bluegrass or, country and Western in those days, you had the same effect or substance, I should say, in those genres insofar that you had an artist kind of airing out a grievance or basically doing storytelling in that mode of communication, which is what J. Cole does, which is what Saba does, which is what, who's another one? Kendrick Lamar has done.
His earlier stuff, I would say.
His earlier stuff, right? Not his more commercial stuff. But then too, you have this interesting component, the gangster rap component, which is very militant, which is very degenerate and provokes and promotes debauchery. That's a different thing entirely. And so there's a whole series of events that has happened. We spoke about many of those at length here from the 60s into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where you see this kind of morphing of the movement that then kind of comes to a climactic point through music. The civil rights movement was a militant movement. What came right after that was the Black Power movement. You had your Black Panthers, you had people like Huey P. Newton, H. Rap Brown, and others who wore the leather jackets and the berets, and they had the fists and everything. That was, it was commercial, but it was propaganda, and it was meant to like emote and to make Black youngsters, especially in light of the King assassination, feel like we're not taking any more. We're going to start the revolution. We're going to be, we're going to lead the revolution. 80s, you had a kind of bit of calm, but then in the 90s, it would pick back up. Of course, in a lot of the NWA stuff, a lot of the Public Enemy stuff, you see this kind of hearkening back, this kind of mentioning of a lot of the famous, pro-Black, Black militant figures like Angela Davis and others. Tupac was really big into that. He was big into,
Was he a character that was propped up? Because I've seen some evidence of that.
Yes, he was. He was. And so
like he wasn't actually who he appeared to be.
That's true. He was, I mean, didn't he go to Juilliard, I think?
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that he did.
I'm pretty sure you're correct.
He was
he
was an artist. He was a character. But the thing is, it's like what you saw with especially the early 90s hip hop, late 80s, early 90s, is this kind of proliferation of coming off the back of the Black militant movement, mingled with this kind of smug attitude of we're no longer taking anything. And this kind of, I mean, if you look at the interviews from around that time, because I mean, these artists were interviewed because what they were doing was just so novel. They are saying things like, we're just not taking it anymore. We're just telling the story from the streets, and this is the reality in which we live. And it just was it just seemed very fabricated and contrived. And it was catchy to a lot of the kids in the streets. And what's interesting about this is that, like, people often ask me if the issue that we're seeing, particularly amongst Black youth, is due to the hip hop industry, the hip hop culture. And my answer on that is interesting, because it's like, when you look at the selling of these records, it's actually true that more white folks buy these records than Blacks do. And of course, you can say, well, there's more white people in the country than Blacks are. But the question for me underneath all of it is, well, why? Why is it that during a drive-by, you're bound to hear, hip hop blaring from the speakers? Is it the case that it has more of a negative impact on a Black youth than a white youth? And I think that although I haven't studied this, my gut is that it does have more of an impact because of a lot of the social ethos and the pathology that exists in Black culture. If you don't have a father, for example, a dad, for example, to counteract what you're hearing from the speakers, then you're not properly able to compartmentalize what you're hearing as entertainment or something to just kind of like take the edge off or listen to.
Right. It's almost like it's reinforcing the lifestyle that you are in or the lifestyle that is around you.
That's correct.
Versus when you are, let's say, in a white neighborhood, so to speak, and you listen to that, you have stuff in general. Again, this is all very generally speaking. There's going to be people that come out of the woodworks that are like, well, that's not my experience. The point that I'm getting at is, very generally speaking, you have things to counteract that in your vicinity, so you know that this is almost akin to like a movie or like a video game or something like that, rather than like, oh, this is a story
that
about my life
emulate.
experience. Yes,
Yeah.
to emulate, exactly.
And so I remember, for example, I'm a millennial. I forget when Ludacris's Chicken and Beer came out, but I want
to say early 2000s.
I had that CD, and I was listening into my CD player. We were on our way to Arkansas to visit family, and I had my headphones on, and I guess like I had it up so loud that like other people in the car could hear it. And my dad heard the song, "Who Let These Hoes in My Room?" I'm listening to the song. I'm however old I am. And my dad was like, "What?" And so he reaches back in the back seat, snatches my CD player, pops it open, takes the CD and flings it out the window. So I'm a teenager listening to "Who Let These Hoes in My Room?" So, but for me, it's like having a dad who was strict, who was a blue collar man, who instilled in us principles and values. Like, I'll listen to a lot of Tupac growing up and Ludacris and all these guys, but I knew that this is just entertainment. It's not something to emulate. I'm not going to start dressing like these guys and talking like these guys and trying to be like these guys or what have you. And then too, there's something to say about the fact that a lot of these artists do come from some of these places. They come from the hood where a lot of the people. So the thing is, I mean, if you have an artist out of West Baltimore, out of Detroit, who grew up alongside the people who still live there, and they're actually doing the things that they're talking about in trap music. You know what I mean? Like, they're actually doing those things. It's not as if they are influenced by hip hop. Like, you have a cultural pathology that's, yes, being expressed through music, but it's not as if, oh, I heard this West Baltimore rapper talk about running up into somebody's houses, killing their grandmother, and therefore I'm going to go do that. Like, no, they were already doing those things. The music is just
it's reinforcing it.
Yeah, it's just reinforcing it. Whereas a Black kid or a white kid who lives in the suburbs, they might just be enjoying it as entertainment. So it becomes a kind of chicken or egg kind of argument.
For sure.
But But yeah, I do think that there's some element, even though it was contrived and it was all theatrics, I do think that there's some element of truth to some of those early interviews where they say, well, this is what's going on in the streets. But at the same time, it's very nefarious because it's like you're popularizing it. You're condoning it.
And as we know, like culture is one of the most influential things. And
exactly.
Like music is a massive part of culture and its influence. And so it's like, if that is the thing that is being glorified when it's already a thing that is present, it's like, oh, I can continue doing this because this is what is cool, essentially, right?
Right.
But the thing that is really interesting to me is when we look at these record labels and the record label owners, it's like they're predominantly people who are not Black that are influencing this. Let's just say it that way. You know what I mean? It's like, that is really interesting. And it's like there could be shadowy elements of Marxist ideologies, we could say, that want to influence in a variety of ways, music being one of them, the Black community to continue to behave like this.
Well, these shadowy figures, we'll call them, what they are hell-bent on doing is taking the grotesque and normalizing it. And they do this, of course, in the entertainment industry. They do this in activism. They do this in all sorts of different avenues and institutions. And it's a destabilization tactic. And they think that what they're doing is just. They think that what they're doing is I mean, there's this guy, his name is Rabbi
Shmuley. Is that who you're going to bring up?
No.
Oh, okay. Because he's another one that's like, whoa.
There's this guy, his name is Rabbi Ben Kamen.
Okay.
He wrote a book called Dangerous Friendship. And what this book does is it chronicles the relationship between Martin Luther King and Stanley Levison. And he basically admits that Stanley Levison was a communist and he died a communist. He strategically left the Communist Party shortly before working with King, not as a kind of denunciation of communism, but as a strategic move because he understood how bad of a look it would be if somebody who's still affiliated with the Communist Party is working with King as his advisor and speechwriter. So that's the reason why he formally left the Communist Party, even though he was still working with them very closely. And he was oftentimes putting King in these networks with other communist strategists and speechwriters. So what's interesting about that is like when you read that book and you read books from his counterparts and compatriots, they talk about the so-called marginalized people, the ghetto people, they call them. And they want to like put the ghetto people in the front, at the forefront. And they want, like, there's no suggestion that, hey, maybe you clean yourself up and maybe you tap into principles and being a person of honor. There's no apology at all for the grotesque and for the pathology. It's you deserve to be catered to. You deserve to have the red carpet laid out before you. You deserve to, it's unfortunate that you're being rejected by society just because, you are a degenerate or whatever the case may be. And so you see, like, from these kind of mothering type social justice activists, there's no, I guess, suggestion that you clean yourself up and get your life together. It's rather society is the problem. You're not the problem. Society is the problem. And we must now implement laws and policies that are meant to protect you as a protected class. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't change anything. You're not the problem. Society is the problem. And that's kind of the mantra of the whole social justice apparatus, as it were. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. Totally makes sense, man.
So
one thing that I forgot to bring up when we were talking about the civil rights movement is Malcolm X, because I've seen a lot of conflicting narratives on Malcolm X and who he was and what he was actually about. I will say, especially throughout COVID, I found myself finding many quotes from Malcolm X to share publicly because it at least confirmed my bias, if you want to call it that, and that a lot of the liberal policies are not to be trusted because, again, as someone who grew up around a lot of Black people, I saw a lot of my Black friends seeming to fall for a lot of the propaganda that was coming from the left at that time with respect to COVID. And I shared a lot of Malcolm X's quotes surrounding white liberals being like a wolf in sheep's clothing and actually having more of a detriment in the Black community than conservatives do. And for those who are listening, watching, you know that I'm neither left nor right. I'm very much libertarian, if not beyond that. So I just love to hear what you've come to understand about Malcolm X?
Yeah, Malcolm X is an interesting person. So I acknowledge the fact that Malcolm X was more right than King was.
More right is in more correct or more right?
More correct than King was, because he did speak about the responsibility of the individual. He did talk about the hypocrisy of forced integration, saying things like, I'd rather a white man voluntarily serve me out of his own volition versus being forced to serve me with the government holding a gun to their head. He said that's called hypocrisy. That's not called love. And so there were a lot of things that Malcolm X said that I 100% agree with. My problem with him is that while he was saying these things, many of these things, he would preface it with, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says this, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad said that. And of course, he would come to reject the Nation of Islam before he died. But when it comes to personal responsibility, when it comes to all these things for which he was advocating, these things didn't originate with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Booker T. Washington was talking about these things years before anybody knew who Elijah Muhammad was. And so while he had the correct solution in many respects, what was driving him to say many of these things, I think he was completely wrong on. So, because the thing is, like, if you follow Nation of Islam to its logical conclusion, it's a detriment. It's not a calculated benefit.
Which is interesting because, like, another rapper that I really like, and then I'm like, some of the things he said, I'm like, what are you doing? Jay Electronica. I don't know if you listen to him at all, but it's like some of his lyrics, I'm like, I really like that.
Yeah.
And then I know that he's a huge supporter of the Nation of Islam. I'm like, okay, he's clearly misled them.
Right. So for me, it's like, Malcolm X is fun to listen to because, again, there's a lot of things I think that he gets right, but it's like you kind of have to know when to get off of the exit. You know what I mean? I think he came to see the corruption in the Nation of Islam, specifically with Elijah Muhammad, and he got a lot of flack for that. And that may be the thing that ultimately got him killed. But if I were to pick between X and King, it's easily X. No questions asked.
But he was speaking some very true things.
He was speaking some true things. But again, even the solutions that I agree with, they didn't originate with him, nor did they originate with Elijah Muhammad. They far precede even Booker T. Washington. I mean, I would argue that they're biblical principles, quite frankly.
Right. Principles of Christ, ultimately.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I mean, this may seem like a rhetorical question as we're wrapping up here. First off, is there anything else you wanted to cover that's like on your heart and mind?
I'm just here for the ride, man.
Okay, cool. I'm sure after this episode airs, there'll be a lot more questions and topics that people will want us to explore. So luckily you're not too far away, so we'll get you back on at some point.
Sounds good.
This may seem rhetorical, and like I know where this is going to go. It's going to go to biblical principles, and that's great. What do you think is the fix for the Black community right now?
I think that it's easier to, and of course this saying didn't originate with me, but I'll echo it here. It's easier to fool somebody than to convince them that they've been fooled. And so for me, thankfully, with a lot of my content, with my films, I have seen the needle moving in the right direction. And it's not just me. There's other people, I guess, who are on the same journey. I just spoke with a guy last night. His name is Jeffrey Mead, out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and his content's exploding. And he's basically calling out the pathology unapologetically. And so the work of convincing people they've been fooled is a very daunting task. It's a very steep uphill battle, but it's one worth doing. Convincing people that they've been fooled, and then of course the solution from there is, in my opinion, to repent and to get back on the right track. I have this this graph that I use to kind of explain what happened in the so-called Black community. From the end of the 1800s to the 1950s, you see this trending in the right direction: family formation, a church-going people, home ownership moving in the right direction, literacy moving in the right direction. And then you come to this kind of crossroads. You either keep going in the same direction, or you take a veer, you take a turn. And in this turn, it's social justice. It's all the things for which King was advocating. So encouraging us to continue going in the right direction are people like Joseph H. Jackson, Malcolm X to some degree. And encouraging us to go in this other direction is Martin King. we chose to go in this other direction. We said to ourselves, you know what? The way that dad and granddad had it, thought about it in terms of growing your own business, doing your own thing. Nikki Giovanni, in a conversation that she had with James Baldwin in the 1970s, she even said the words out loud that my generation is not doing what our mother's generation did. She said, my mothers and my aunts, they were women who were the masters of their house. They served their husbands well. They served their children well. We're not doing that. We are insisting on a new way. We're going our own way, says Nikki Giovanni in the mid 70s. So you have this decision. We're going to take a veer. We're going to take a detour and go in this other direction. So we literally took a turn for the worse. And as a result of this, 70+% of Black children growing up in a single mother household. Many Black children are not reading or doing math at grade level. We see broken homes. We see the so-called disparities, the gaps widening. We see an increase in the pathology. We see the smug disposition. We see the entitlement. We see seeing the race paranoia, seeing racism where there is no racism. These are all the kind of attributes of having gone that direction. So we have to identify where we went wrong and what are the things that we decided to believe that actually has worked more to our detriment than to our benefit. And we have to repent of that. And repenting means turning around. That's what it means to repent, is to turn around. And I believe that in the Bible, there's I forget which verse it is, but I think Jesus asked Peter, will you too leave me? Like, will you also leave? And Peter tells Jesus, Lord, to whom shall we go? Whom else shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. And I believe that to be true. I believe that Christ alone has the words of eternal life. And if you look at the teachings of Christ, whether it's the Beatitudes and how, the law can be summed up into one thing: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. When it comes to, Jesus is teaching on, being a good steward of what you have. I mean, like when he says that one person was given 5 talents, another 2, and another 1, the man who had 5 talents was able to go and double it. The same is true of the one who had 2. The one who had 1 went and buried his treasure or buried his talents. And we're learning about being a good steward, being a good steward of what you have, whether you have a lot or you have a little. Like, the teachings of Christ are whole. The teachings of Christ are life-giving. They're practical, but also they're eternal. And so he alone has the words of eternal life. And to go in another direction, I don't think will work to the benefit of us in a practical sense. And so I do think repentance is really the only way. Of course, there's a lot of practical things that we can do to kind of shake loose from this notion that the government will fix anything and that policies will fix everything. And of course, that can exist outside of one becoming a Christian.
Took in moral principles too. And at the same time, I think if there is universally applicable moral principles that can apply to everyone, Christian or not, it would be like biblical principles, in my opinion.
Right. So I do believe in Christendom. I do believe that biblical principles and values that are informing governance is the best a nation can do, or a state or a local community can do.
But not in like a fascist sense.
Not in a fascist sense, but in the sense that God is a God of common grace. Yeah. The Bible says that God allows the rain to fall on the just as well as the unjust. It allows the sun to rise on the wicked as well as the righteous. And so we know God is a God of common grace. And so if you are a person in politics, or if you are in an executive branch or what have you, and you operate in such a way that you are exacting common grace, where you are being fair and you don't have a respect for persons, like you're dividing the law equally and all the things like that, that's a gift from God. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, like, I don't have if I'm in politics, I don't have the final say on what happens to your soul. You know what I mean? But I can govern what happens within my jurisdiction, if you will. And if you are threatening somebody's person or property, the law applies to you. So
sounds like a Christian libertarian position, essentially.
Yeah. But the thing is like, if you look at the gospel, if you look at Jesus's commission to his remnant, to his disciples, is to go to the ends of the earth, preaching the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit. He also says that if a community doesn't accept the gospel that you preach, merely shake the dust from your feet and keep it moving to the next town. You're not going to force somebody either by law or by word to be a Christian. That's a decision that each individual has to make on their own.
Free market.
So exactly. So again, but at the same time, to the extent that the majority or the plurality of a people in a given jurisdiction who have Christian values basically elect a person to govern or to be the mayor of their jurisdiction, I would venture to say that the morale of that community would be higher than that of a secular community who has in its legislative body atheists and anarchists and so on.
Hold on anarchy though. Do you know the definition of anarchy? Because there's two.
Okay, go ahead.
One is what we commonly think anarchy to mean, and that's like looting, burning, pillaging in the streets.
That's the sense in which I meant it.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I struggle with that because it's just like on your capitalism thing. Like, hold on, like capitalism means like capital above all else. Anarchy can also mean no rulers. And that's the sense that I take it to mean, because that's where I meant libertarian or even beyond that. Like, because I just think the concept of at least like the form of government that we have now, which is separate from governance and organizing on a societal level, which there's a lot of questions surrounding the Dunbar number. I don't know if you've ever heard that. Like, I think there's a lot of like, there's a lot of validity to that is what I'm saying. But I like to say anarchy in terms of that, the second definition.
Yeah. So what does a society that doesn't have rulers look like?
So it would require people to be.
And what is a ruler?
So this is a good question. I think let me go with what we have right now, right? I think it is fundamentally immoral to have a subset of the population be able to use the mechanisms of government in order to impose their belief system on the rest of the population, no matter how big or small. Because like at the end of the day, the minority, if we want to call it that, the smallest minority is the individual. So I'm very big on like individual rights and liberties and not having their property or their bodily autonomy infringed upon. Now, your question on what is a ruler, that's a good question, because like there's a spectrum of that, right? Obviously, at the one end, it looks like a dictator, like full-on fascist, or like a king who is tyrannical, right? And I don't think Donald Trump is a ruler. I don't think Joe Biden was a ruler. In fact, I think overwhelmingly, the phrase "the government obtains its authority through the consent of the governed" is very true. I think that we consent to all of these things, whether we're conditioned into giving our consent or we actually give our consent because we're begging for whatever policies are enacted, which I think oftentimes is ultimately the result of manipulation as well. But the point that I'm getting at is that I don't think we have a king. So like the no kings protest thing I think is ridiculous, because on either side of the spectrum, I don't think there's actually a king. It's that we are handing over our power to these tyrants, in my opinion.
Yeah, we get the government we deserve.
Yeah, we get the government we deserve.
Yeah.
And so with that, like what would a society look like with no rulers? This is where it's like the pragmatic side of me wrestles with the principled side of me. Because I know that I would not want, no matter how large or small, my belief systems imposed onto others via the mechanisms of government, right? So if there is to be any form of government that is moral and just, it is one that is simply only ensuring that men and women do not infringe upon the rights of other men and women, on the sovereignty of other men and women and their property. That's it. That's it. But that could also be handled in a true free market. And here's an example. So someone would ask like, okay, so who's going to pay for the roads in schools if we didn't have government, right? Or who's going to pay for the roads? People in a free market will pay for something that is valuable to them. And some would pay more than others would pay. But ultimately, like in a small area, let's say we don't have this, but let's say there wasn't any roads in a certain area, right? And this is a voluntarist area. And they want to get from point A to point B, people will come together and be like, hey, we need to build this. Like people did it before taxation, right? Then on the protection side of things, when it comes to police, right now, the police have a monopoly on enforcing laws and protecting, right? And most police are incredible, well-intentioned people. I acknowledge that. But they're also power-hungry police officers that infringe upon the rights of people. And they don't have any competition because they have the monopoly on those things. In a true free market, you could have competing private security forces. And let's say I live in a neighborhood that there's been some break-ins recently, right? And I don't feel that I can sufficiently protect myself. I can volunteer to pay for that service for this private security to come in and do some patrols and get my neighbors to be like, hey, you guys have had a break-in your house recently. You have too. Let's pull some money together and pay for this service voluntarily. And actually, we're looking at the independent ratings on that place. This private security force might actually be better. They've accidentally killed 2 people who were completely harmless or were, not actually committing any crimes. So let's go with them. Free market decides we're going to go with them instead because they actually offer legitimate protection and they actually fulfill that role appropriately, right? The point that I'm getting at is like a lot of stuff that the government occupies could be done in the private. Private businesses.
I agree with that.
And so it's not that there wouldn't be some sort of order or rules, but like the ultimate rule ultimately goes back to the golden rule almost, and it's more expressed in like the term anarchism or voluntarism, in that all interactions between all men and women or all organizations and entities, et cetera, should be on a voluntary basis between all parties. That's it.
Yeah, I mean, there's consequences in the grand scheme of things for a life that one lives. I mean, we read this in a book of Ecclesiastes. I forget how the book ends, but it says something to the effect that, fear God and keep his commands, for we all have to give an account for the lives that we lived. So, in the grand scheme of things, we all have to give an account for how we lived. However, while we're on this earth, you're not forced to do something against your will. And so that's why I take it back to like God is a God of common grace. Like he could have easily forced Adam and Eve to not eat the forbidden fruit. That was their choice to make. And so like I think what you're explaining is reminiscent of how God himself governs, and what we've seen in the name of many of the ideologies that would proverbiate across the 20th century is exactly the point of trying to force people to share the values of the state. In the Soviet Union in particular, people were called the enemies of progress or the enemies of the state. They were lined up against walls and shot. They were collected and thrown into the gulag. This happened in Soviet Union. This happened in Mao's China. This happened in Castro's Cuba. This happened over and over and over again. It happened in some aspects in our own country. A lot of people don't know about this, but it happened during the war between the states, where you had Union-ran concentration camps. And so, yes, I mean, I never heard it explained the way that you just broke it down.
But did I sufficiently explain it?
You did.
Yeah.
You did. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And again, that's where I wrestle with the principled versus the pragmatic. Like the principled side of me is like, I'm sorry, if I'm going to adhere strictly to my principles, government in its current iteration, whether it's a democratic republic or like a democracy, is at some level fundamentally immoral because it's not accounting for the needs of the individual. And on the flip side of that, pragmatically, okay, how do we organize society? I don't know. I don't claim to have all the answers for that.
What do you think about the notion that fascism is a reaction to hyper-liberalism?
100%. I would totally agree with that. I mean, that's what we see emerging right now is like people who are proudly fascist. And I don't mean it in like the liberal sense of like, pointing to anyone who's not exclusively like trans supporting, trans affirming, DEI affirming, and pointing to anyone else and saying that they're fascist. I mean, like true fascism is emerging as an ideology right now. I don't think it's rampant among society, but like in some of the fringe elements on Twitter and elsewhere, like fascism is absolutely a thing that is popping up right now. Right, yeah. Right. And I don't think it's a good thing, but I think it's a natural consequence of the pendulum going so far one way that people want to go back to like hyper-nationalist fascism the other way. You know what I mean? And where, again, it's another false dichotomy though, man. It's another example of a false dichotomy. I have one more thing I want to bring up, if that's okay. Do you have time? Okay. So because we were talking about police and things like this, I have witnessed myself where some of my black friends are treated differently by police officers than my white friends were when I was growing up. That's one thing. And then the second thing is there's something that doesn't sit right with me about a lot of black men being incarcerated for nonviolent crimes for selling drugs. We can argue all day on like whether it was immoral, but then are we conflating morality with law? Because there is crossover between the two, but they're not always synonymous with each other. I think you would acknowledge that, right? Which is why I'm like very big on getting the government out of everything, overwhelmingly speaking. That being said, like now that weed is being legalized, there's dudes that are locked up for selling like a few grams of weed. And now companies are making millions of dollars off that same thing now because it's quote unquote legalized.
What's the solution?
In my opinion, and again, this requires radical responsibility, right? So I would decriminalize everything. I would allow the states to do that. I would want the federal government not be involved at all.
So that's the big thing there. You know, states under the 10th Amendment are basically allowed to legislate or to enact laws or repeal laws when it comes to things that are not exclusively mentioned in, the federal law. I agree that, when it comes to, federal crimes as it pertains to drugs and things of this nature, I'm in alignment with you that there shouldn't be any laws on the books. When you get to like the trafficking of narcotics across the border, that's something different entirely. But when it comes to the prison time that one should or shouldn't get for selling drugs in their local community, that's something that that I do believe is a state issue. And even beyond that, a local issue.
I would say a local issue.
The interesting thing about the whole drugs, the age-old debate of powder cocaine versus crack cocaine and all that.
And CIA involvement.
And all the things. It is also true that while the selling of crack was going on in a lot of these communities, there's a lot of violence that was involved in it as well. Territorial disputes. It was pretty bad. And it was a big issue. It was a big problem. And so it's easy to look back in retrospect. It's easy to retroactively look back and say this shouldn't have happened and that shouldn't have happened. And I would agree that like the federal government saw it as an opportunity to expand its own authority because that's what it always does. It's what it always does. But at the same time, like I do believe that there should have been something done at the local and probably even state level to the fact that there was a lot of violent crimes, shootouts in broad daylight that were going on in the 90s as a result of, what was going on. And of course, it creates a circular kind of argument because people will say, well, the government's the one that put those drugs there to begin with. It's like, true. But there were decisions that were made by individuals to sell the drugs, to buy the drugs, to pick up guns and to fight over sidewalks over the drugs. So like there's, again, radical responsibility there.
We consent to it with our own free will.
So, while I do think it's helpful to hash it out and to talk about like, how unfortunate it is that these people are in jail and those people are in jail, the question for me is always, now what? What's the solution here? Yeah. Because I don't want to wallow and cry over, what happened in the past. And some people might call me a hypocrite because I'm literally making the MLK docuseries, but that's once again to give insight into what happened and what transpired.
Into where we are now.
Yeah, to where we are now. Because when it comes to King and other civil rights industry activists, we haven't seen the last of them. They're going to continue to be before us. Demagogues will always be before us. The question is, will you be too emotionalized to see them for what they are and continually and perpetually fall for the ruse? Or will you be an independent thinker and ask the proper questions so you're not constantly being taken for a ride? That's the purpose, is to show you what the Trojan horse looks like. So that way you can, moving forward, identify the Trojan horse. That's the purpose of doing the MLK project. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who, even after learning that the Trojan horse is in fact a Trojan horse, they're still mesmerized by how pretty the colors are and how well crafted the figure is, and it just speaks so well and it just looks so good, and they're still going to celebrate it, and that's fine. That's fine. But at least now that it's a Trojan horse. Yeah. So
well said, man.
I'm not trying to run from the question, but again, what's the solution?
No, that's fair. That's a fair response, man. Okay, we've been going for like 3 hours, I think. Reese, is that right? Okay. We'll wrap it here, man.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for what you're producing, what you're putting out. I forget which video I saw where I was finally like, I need to get him on my show, but you're putting out a lot of good stuff. So I really appreciate your perspective. We didn't get to talk about Candace and some of the things you disagree with her on and all that stuff, but we can talk about that another time. So
yeah.
As we're wrapping up, is there anything you'd like to share?
No, I just appreciate you having me out and having me on. I admire what you're doing from afar. So keep up the good work. I appreciate it.
Thank you, bro.
Yeah.